Number 5. Left 4 Dead 2. Up first on our list is Left 4 Dead 2, the sequel to Valve's 2008 smash hit Left 4 Dead. Left 4 Dead 2 changed the game entirely, revolutionizing the zombie genre and reinventing everything you knew about Left 4 Dead by taking the exact same game and setting it in Louisiana instead of Pennsylvania. Now the actual game is amazing. I could hark sweet nothings about Left 4 Dead all day. The 4-player co-op zombie survival game was some of the most fun you could have with an internet connection back in the day. I probably lost hundreds of hours of my 8th grade playing Left 4 Dead 2. But if you happen to live somewhere like Australia or Germany, you wouldn't been able to have played Left 4 Dead 2 at all, since because of its intense depictions of violence, the game was deemed too heinously gory to be sold, classifying it as too violent to be sold as an MA-15 game, the highest rating Australia had at the time. Valve tried to fight back against the classification as much as they could, insisting that all the violence depicted in the game was against zombies, who are no longer human. They just look like humans and fall apart pretty easily. The workaround? Valve released a heavily censored release of Left 4 Dead 2 for international markets, which removes just about everything yucky. No missing limbs, no guts, gore, blood, and piles of bodies are all gone out of the Australian release. Oddly, and possibly as an apology for removing content, the German release of Left 4 Dead 2 also heavily censored all the violence, features weaponry not available in any other releases of the game, all ported over from Counter-Strike's source. Pretty funny to note as well, the cover art for Left 4 Dead 2 is a severed hand missing a couple fingers, with 2 fingers held up to denote that it's Left 4 Dead 2, like this. Well, because that gesture is considered rude in England, the cover was replaced there with a variant where the hand is facing backwards. And hey, on the off chance anybody from Valve's watching, if you guys wouldn't mind, I really would like another Left 4 Dead. Don't forget to subscribe for more horror content coming your way every day. Number 4. Silent Hill Homecoming. Silent Hill has always been one of the most terrifying video game series on the planet. When you think of the hulking Pyramid Head or any of the other flesh monstrosities that wander the restless dreams of that town, Silent Hill has always been good at making your hair stand on end. Silent Hill Homecoming was the 5th Silent Hill released, and the first by a studio that wasn't Team Silent. The player is put into the boots of Alex Shepard, a Spec Ops combat veteran returning to his hometown, not of Silent Hill, but its neighboring town of Shepherd's Glen. It's a homecoming, if you will. Now the actual game is okay. I'm too close to Silent Hill to speak about the series fairly. I wouldn't say it's the scariest Silent Hill, and it's not the best, but it's also not the worst. It's kind of just right in the middle. But it's the only game in the series that was ever outright banned. The game contains some pretty intense violence, probably the goriest entry in the series, I would say. A scene in particular depicts our hero Alex struggling against a cultist enemy, and if Alex fails the event, Alex gets a drill into him violently, and if he succeeds, the cultist gets the drill, so either way, somebody is losing bad. And that someone is the nations of Australia, Germany, and Japan, as the game was refused classification for Australia and Germany, and speaking of which, those two are going to come up a lot on this list, as they really do not like violence in their games. Japan is a little more confusing, as I couldn't find why the game was never sold in Japan. Violence doesn't usually tend to get a game banned in Japan, so it's unknown why it was never available there. But to our Japanese viewers, I gotta say, you're really not missing out on too much. Don't worry. Number 3. Agony. Agony, 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 agony. I was working at a video game store when this one came out, and boy do I remember the controversy around it. Our store only got a single copy of the game. Agony was a 2018 survival horror game that set out on a mission to be the most disgusting game ever released, and in a lot of ways, they achieved that. Agony follows the story of a lost soul condemned to hell with no memory of their former life, and like anyone who'd be trapped in hell, are trying fruitlessly to escape. Agony's main selling point was its intense depiction of hell, overflowing with blood, gore, fire, and brimstone. Agony is pretty much non-stop gooey gore from the second the game starts. The game was actually heavily censored before even being released, as initial ratings of Agony received the infamous adults only rating, which would have prevented it from being sold in major retailers or online platforms. So the final product had to be heavily edited just to even meet the M17 rating, the highest rating the ESRB gives out. I feel like it's worth throwing this out there if you're hearing about this and you think that I made Agony sound kinda cool and you want to check the game out. I'll let you know that the controversy seems like it was more a marketing thing because the actual game is kind of bad. For all its overwhelming gore, it gets really dull fast. You know, you walk into one room full of nightmarish, incomprehensible walls of 1,000 wretched faces screaming and crying blood, and really, you've seen them all, you know? The game gets pretty samey really fast, and the actual gameplay is really dull despite its environments. After its release, it became clear that Agony was nothing more than a maypole for controversy. Number 2. Condemned: Criminal Origins. Condemned: Criminal Origins was a launch title for the Xbox 360 all the way back in 2005. So I wouldn't be surprised if you forgot about it. It was a first-person survival horror game where you played a detective built like a linebacker, hunting a serial murderer on the trail of a series of condemned buildings, obviously, all the while being attacked by populations of the city who have all gone violently mad by some mysterious force. Now, Condemned is probably the scariest game on this list, and I'd go so far as to say it's one of the scariest games I've ever played in my life, drawing major inspiration from films like Seven, Silence of the Lambs, and Saw. Condemned is the kind of game that makes you feel like you'd need to take a boiling shower afterwards and scrub yourself. The game is entirely in a first-person perspective, and you really feel like you are knee-deep in the filthy grime of the city. So what banned Condemned? Well, in Germany, the game was refused to be sold because of a law stating that any depictions of cruel or otherwise inhuman acts of violence against human beings in a manner which expresses a glorification, which really could describe any of the video games I listed today. Interestingly, unlike a lot of the other ones on this list, Condemned was actually banned after it was released, not before. Its sequel, Condemned Bloodshot, was also banned for the exact same reasons. Now, for what it's worth, Condemned is pretty vile and pretty scary. It's a testament to how disturbing the game is in its depictions of horror, foregoing supernatural elements and trying to depict the situation as realistically as possible. You do have to admit, it is kind of ironic too that when you think about it, the game itself was condemned. Still, nonetheless, if you're feeling brave and up for it, I would recommend checking it out. It is horrifying. Number 1. Manhunt. There could not have been any other game at number 1 on the list about banned horror video games. If you're passionate about horror games and you know your horror game history, you were probably already expecting for Manhunt to show up. When you really think about it, Manhunt is probably one of the most infamous video games ever released. Manhunt comes to us from Rockstar Games, who are definitely no stranger to controversy, being the developers behind Grand Theft Auto. If anything, they welcome controversy, even going so far as in the early days paying for bad reviews for the GTA games to make them seem cooler. A contraband video game? What kid wouldn't want that? Well, Manhunt was a similar situation. Almost all of Rockstar's games see you playing a criminal of some kind, be it a thug, an outlaw, or a high school bully. But Manhunt has you playing as a death row inmate who is kidnapped by a sick benefactor known as the Director, who communicates to you through an earpiece, and in exchange for your freedom, wants to watch you take out members of various gangs across the city while he watches you on hijacked CCTV cameras for his sick pleasure. As the player fights off depraved gangsters, criminals, and one particularly memorable delusional chainsaw-wielding naked pig mask-wearing psychopath, you'll find yourself caught in a grisly web. Now, video game violence has always been a very touchy subject. What is too realistic? Where is the line? Manhunt very intentionally walked that line. A quote from ex-Rockstar developer Jeff Williams, who contributed to Manhunt, had this to say: "The game just made us all feel icky. It was all about the violence, and it was about realistic violence. We all knew there was no way we could explain away this game. We all knew we were crossing a line. There was almost a mutiny in the staff over it." A Manhunt sees the player executing people for the pleasure of the Director, all using household objects and disturbingly realistic depictions of violence. Infamously, Manhunt was involved in a real-life tragic death, with the assailant having been purported to have been obsessed with the game by friends, which led to efforts to have the game banned outright from stores. In New Zealand, owning Manhunt was actually considered a criminal charge. You could get charged for having this video game in your home. The province of Ontario restricted Manhunt to the dreaded AO rating, pulling it from store shelves. Despite the intense nature of the game and the controversy surrounding it, Manhunt went on to be a cult classic. It sold well, it wasn't banned as widespread as Rockstar had feared, and to this day, it still even has its fans. It sold and reviewed well enough to even get a sequel, which very bizarrely was exclusive to the Nintendo Wii, a console exclusively known for its family-friendly entertainment. Nothing more family-friendly than Manhunt.
In at number 5 we have Kill Switch. Kill Switch was created in 1989 by a Russian gaming company. Only 5,000 copies of the game were made. The story follows a woman waking up in a coal mine. You follow her mission to the surface, encountering demonic inspectors, undead miners, and possessed machinery. One of the first horror games, Kill Switch had a side-on viewpoint. You would find recordings around the mine that would tell you more about what happened to the people here. There were other puzzles with long arcs, including one described as laughably complex in the form of markings on the axes of undead enemies. The markings were in code, and figuring out the cipher for this code was the second hardest thing to do in the game. You had a pet in the game named Gust. Not much is known about Gust, but the developers described them as Porto and her beloved Gust. You could switch to Ghast and become invisible to enemies, but also to you as the player, so although it was useful, it was easy to lose where your own character was on screen. As mentioned before, there were only 5,000 copies of the game created, and as the first few players completed the game, the remaining copies became precious. As people started to finish the game, there were reports that the game completely destroys itself on completion. It was never confirmed if this was done to make the game more mysterious or if a virus has attached itself to the game. Players were not happy about this. You would never be able to play the game again if you enjoyed it. More than that, the more people who completed the game, the rarer it became. Today, not many people, if any, have ever played it. The game is thought to have dragged itself into extinction. It quickly gained the reputation of being cursed. In 1989, it is believed that the technology needed to program the game to self-destruct just did not exist, and if it did, it would be worth far more than the game itself. It is a mystery as to how this happened. People have since created their own safe versions of the game, so if you do fancy giving the game a go, please stick to this version. Coming in at number 4, we have Hall of Tortured Souls. Hall of Tortured Souls is an Easter egg from Windows 95. This Easter egg started a rumor in the 90s that Microsoft might be hiding satanic secrets. Hall of Tortured Souls seems like a horror game, but it was designed to give credit to the creators of Windows 95, something that clearly horribly backfired. To see the game for yourself, you would have to somehow launch Microsoft Excel 95, open a blank Excel worksheet, and go down to the 95th row. Select the entire row, then tap and hold Ctrl, Alt and Shift. After this, the game will appear. The game has a simple visual look to it, much like the games of the 90s. When the game has launched, the title Hall of Tortured Souls will appear. You can walk in any direction. You will see different hallways for you to walk down. You can also walk through the walls. There are some obstacles and puzzles within the game with names of creators flashing on screen periodically. In the final room, there is a photo of the creators on a large box screen. No one ever explained why this was created. No one from Microsoft came forward to officially speak about the game. This started a rumor that the game was created as a cry for help. The names listed might have been all of the tortured souls that worked for the company who were scared to come forward. After all, someone gave out the sequence needed to launch the game, but no further information was ever given. The game is creepy to look at now, with even the pictures of the employees looking inverted and strange to look at. Do you think this was a cry for help or a signal something bad was happening to those who worked for Microsoft? Coming in at number 3, S.T.A.L.K.E.R. S.T.A.L.K.E.R was a fantasy RPG game created in 2007. The game seems to have been cursed since development, with the game's release being anything but easy. It was created by the studio Factor 5. They're no longer in business. The release of this game ruined its relationship with Sony and they never recovered. The game cost the studio around $25 million and took around 3 years to create. This includes a year of delays due to issues inside of the company. During development, Sony launched their new 6-axis PS3 controller with built-in motion capabilities. Although the Factor 5 team saw this was going to be a flop, Sony insisted. They built this into the game. This was the first major setback. During development, members of the team began getting sick. Some of them passed away. There were also members of the team who had family members suffering from horrible illnesses. This is what started the rumors of a curse attaching itself to anyone who involved themselves in the project. This is not where the curse stopped though. In terms of the game, the biggest hurdle came when it came to transferring the data of the game onto a server. The servers crashed due to a power outage and large sections of the game were lost. The team were devastated. They had already been working on this for years. They had lost a lot of work and time. Members of the team had been let go due to budget cuts and they now had to start rebuilding the game. There were times when the release of S.T.A.L.K.E.R looked like it was never going to happen. After launch, there was a lot of bugs in the game. Although it was received well, you could see the troubled development throughout the various issues. After all this, the team had their final blow when the company had to close 2 years after the game was released. There aren't any reports of users being cursed by the game, just the team behind it, so you might be safe as long as you're not planning to create a sequel or mod the game in any way. Coming in at number 2, we have Polybius. Polybius was an arcade game created in 1981. There were only a few machines created and they were all places in arcades in Portland, Oregon. The game was a simple shooter similar to Space Invaders, with the player having to shoot the shapes in the center of the screen before they reach them. The game quickly gained the reputation of being very addictive. The few machines in existence had lines forming behind them and players arguing over who would have the next go. The game was only available for 1 month after claims it was causing players to get seriously ill. After the month, the games all mysteriously disappeared. Due to the flashing shapes and lights in the game, it was reported that many people who played it would suffer from a seizure. It claimed a few more players' lives. Not only did it cause seizures, but other players reported having horrible nightmares that made them question reality. Others developed such an addiction they lost their jobs, homes, and much more, all within the game being available for only 4 weeks. Who knows what more might have happened had the game been kept available to players. It was not clear at the time or now who created the games. They seem to appear mysteriously and disappear the same way. If you do want to know more, there was an investigation into what happened. The researchers created a podcast titled The Eeriest Conspiracy, and they look into all of the mystery of the game, including the claims. It was a government-run experiment to see how people would react to the addictive visuals. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have Sad Satan. Sad Satan is a PC game that was first reported in 2015. It was reported on by a YouTuber who claimed they were told about the game from a subscriber. They were given a link to the website that the fan had found on the deep web. Of course, anything from the dark web is not to be trusted. The most troubling part to the whole story is that as the YouTuber Obscure Horror Corner played through the game, subscribers got more concerned for their well-being. After they posted part 4 of the playthrough, they were never heard from again. That was 6 years ago now. No one knows where they are, what happened to them. If you go to that video, there are comments from today from fans looking for them, asking if they're okay. We might never know what happened after playing this cursed game. Since he played the game, it was never found again. No one was able to find the link or uncover where the game was. People have searched high and low on the dark web, and no evidence of the game has ever existed. The game itself is a hard one to describe. It seems all you can do is move around. There is no combat or interacting with objects. You simply explore the area, which is distorted and not well lit. Disturbing images flash on the screen as you move around. Obscure Horror Corner's playthrough has millions of views and comments of people desperate for answers about the game and their whereabouts. Please do not go looking for this game. And if you're out there, Obscure Horror Corner, I hope you're okay. Coming in at number 5, we have Rule of Rose. The Rule of Roses came out on PS2 in 2006. Rule of Roses is a survival horror game. It was set in England in 1930. You play as a 19-year-old woman who becomes trapped in a world ruled by young girls who have established their own hierarchy and rules. It is seen as a dark and twisted game. Before it was even released, it was banned in many countries due to topics it touches on. This means it was already seen as a mystery to the public and made them want to play it even more. It is said to push you psychologically as you explore an old orphanage. When the game was released, the talk around the game only grew. As the first few gamers got their hands on the new release, it appeared to not be a fun experience. This game did fly under the radar slightly as it was released on PS2 shortly after the release of the PS3, meaning many people had already moved on to their new console and were not playing new releases for the previous gen. There was a couple of deaths related to the game. It was reported that they were scared to death. Although the official report is heart attack induced by stress, these deaths could be completely coincidental. However, it does seem highly suspicious that these players were on the game at the time that they passed away. The game pushed them to such fear and stress that their hearts simply gave out. Whether it is a major coincidence or the game is truly cursed, I would say that it is not worth finding out. Coming in at number 4, we have Momo. The Blue Whale / Momo game is less of a video game you start playing and more of a real-life social media game. It started in 2019, mostly in Russia. It is believed that the game was started on Facebook. There are a group of admins who use the page to give daily tasks to its members. The members are given daily tasks to complete over 50 days. It is unclear why the players keep playing. There is no clear incentive or prize that they will receive. For this reason, it is believed that those who play become cursed. This curse drives them crazy. They get paranoid, feeling like they're being followed. They believe that by finishing the game they would be saved from the curse. That once they completed the final task, they would finally be free. Unfortunately, that is not the case. On the 50th day, what seems to have happened with a number of players is that they post the blue whale on their Instagram account before taking their own life. This blue whale is the biggest indicator that they have been playing the game. The people who run the game seem to be able to manipulate the players to do whatever it is they want them to. The police were unable to get to the bottom of who was running the game. This again made people believe it may have been an entity, something that used this technology to spread its curse and seep into those people's lives to do what they need them to do, then dispose of them when they're done. There hasn't been much talk of the game in some years. The more the game was talked about and information was spread, the less people fell for playing the game. Most people these days are aware of the game, so it cannot take any more victims. If you do stumble across the game, do not join the group. It is believed once you complete the first task, there is no way way out. Coming in at number 3 we have Pokemon 1996. In 1996, Pokemon created a version for portable consoles. It was the first version of Pokemon on Game Boy. Shortly after its launch, Japan had to look into some terrifying concerns. In the summer that the game was released, self-death rates between 6 to 12-year-olds shot up drastically. When looking into this, it appeared they all had one thing in common: they all owned the Pokemon game. They had all become addicted to the game, as is usually the case with such a huge launch. There was one dark location within the game that seemed to be the cause for the problem. The area name was Lavender Town, which was hidden away within the game. This town was created as the eternal resting place for the deceased. You could walk around the ghost town and visit the graveyard. It was not just visiting the town that was the problem, it was reportedly the music. The Japanese version has a terrifying soundtrack to this town, which was reportedly chilling and caused strange effects on players. Players would feel irritable, accompanied by insomnia. An investigation into the deaths was launched. They found that they all had one thing in common: their last game was saved in Pueblo Lavender. After the investigation, they had to pull the game in all the locations. They changed the music as they decided that this was most likely the cause of the disturbing events. The company who developed the game was looked into, and they had kept a list of all the children affected by the game. Evidence that they knew what was going on long before it became so tragic. It would be hard to get your hands on the original version of the game, but if you do consider playing it, maybe play it on mute. In at number 2 we have Berserk. In 1980, S.T.A.L.K.E.R Electronics released the game Berserk. It was brought on in arcade versions and for Atari 2600. The game was known to be one of the first shooter games of all time. The game was capitalizing on the hype around robots at the time. The premise of the game is to kill the robots and try to escape for the facility. If you took too long in any section, Evil Otto will come to get you. Once released, it did not take long for claims to rise that the game had killed players. It might seem unlikely, but these deaths were confirmed. The first victim was 17-year-old Jeff Daly. He was playing the game at the arcade with his friends when he spent hours on Berserk to try and beat his top score. He finally beat it and reached 16,660 points. The minute the score went through the system, he suffered a heart attack and passed away. A few weeks later, there was an 18-year-old boy, Peter Pukowski, who had the exact same thing happen to him. Neither boys had previous health conditions. This caused a panic around the game. The media began to look into it and report on what was happening. A coroner did an autopsy on both bodies and created a report for the media on what might have happened. He said he could confirm they previously had no conditions. What he thinks happened was the stress of the game was too intense for these young boys to handle. He reported that the stress triggered a heart attack. There had been more deaths reported in relation to the game, but none have been looked into like those of the first 2 victims. There are no reports of the arcade or Atari versions being pulled. If you did manage to get your hands on a copy and play it today, you would have to be careful. Getting this high score is not worth your life. And finally, in at number 1 we have Taboo: The Sixth Sense. Taboo was released by Nintendo in 1989 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. The game was for tarot reading. You would simply input your name and date of birth and then ask about your future. You would then receive a usual tarot reading after it draws your chosen cards. The game had a lot of symbols of religion and even nudity, things that would not get approved in a game today. They expected this game to be family friendly, that you could enjoy with everyone, but many people became disturbed by the game and what it would tell them. Parents began to feel it was not safe for their children to be playing with games like this. Particularly disturbing was the game predicting the death of a few young players. It predicted their tragic deaths at their young age. The myth is that soon after it was predicted, a number of the predictions came true. Many players took the game seriously and believed that it could in fact tell the future. The manual of the game read, "We are not responsible for what may happen when Taboo or any effect, influence or miracle that may occur in the relation to the game." The mystery of Taboo confirmed that the game announced the death of some young people, who therefore supposedly died. Nintendo did not want the talk around this game to continue. They decided to permanently remove the game from its catalogue and pull it from its shelves. Of course, no matter how much they tried to bury the game, there are still copies out there and people who remember playing the game. If you do get your hands on a copy, please be careful. Once you know how you will die, there is nothing you can do to change your fate.
Starting off at number 5, Kolat. Kolat is a Polish horror game released in 2015 and is the most directly inspired by real events of any of the games on this list, putting you in the shoes of an explorer setting out to uncover the truth and close the case on the Dilatov Pass incident, a mystery that's plagued and terrified terrified people for 60 years. 9 Russian college students disappeared under incredibly mysterious circumstances in the winter while trekking out in the mountains. This is of course based on the real-life Dilatov Pass incident where this exact thing happened. A group of friends went out for a trek in the mountains, and after no word was heard from the group for nearly a month, a search party set out, and after months and months of searching the mountains, eventually police found the remains of the hikers. 6 had passed from hypothermia, and 3 of them had horrific internal injuries. It's a very famous case, and I invite you to read about it after this video because it is fascinating and terrifying, and no one had gotten to the bottom of it, so it seemed like a good setting for a survival horror mystery game that's also narrated by Sean Bean for some reason. Yeah, Sean Bean narrates this one. I don't know why, but because he's the narrator, he can't die, so he's got that going for him. While the most common hypothesis is that the group suffered under an avalanche, the game offers a much more complex narrative than that, featuring a bit of government conspiracy, supernatural dealings, and all the usual checklist stuff you'd expect from an indie Steam horror game. I've never actually played it, so I can't comment on it too much. I did watch the trailer, looks pretty cool, but I like to throw in one indie game in these lists that nobody's ever heard of. Check Collab out, go give it a shot. And if you're enjoying all the content we're putting out, first of all, thank you very much, but might I suggest subscribing or clicking through for loads more horror content? We got loads of videos and we love the clicks. Let's keep going. Number 4, Outlast. Nothing is scarier than being alone in a dark hospital at night, and it's made even worse when all the patients are deranged and violent from years of government-sanctioned brainwashing. That's Outlast. If you haven't played Outlast, you play as an intrepid journalist who goes off to investigate an asylum after an anonymous whistleblower sends you a tip to go check it all out because something freaky is happening up there. So you do, and in classic horror video game guy fashion, you only bring a camera with you and nothing else, and don't even tell anyone you're going. You barely even bring batteries. You discover that the asylum has gone downhill, to say the least, and the inmates are running the asylum and are all too far gone to even know what's happening anymore, and are all violently hostile to outsiders. We learn as we venture through the halls that all the inmates have been experimented on by a cruel corporation trying to research the usual super soldier stuff, using all sorts of immoral research to try and activate extrasensory powers on people. Now, of course, Outlast does get pretty fantastical and horrifying, and I don't want to spoil too much, but eventually you are, like, running away from ghosts and psychic conscious monsters, which, as far as I know, doesn't exist. But the horrors of Outlast, the really scary stuff, isn't the bloody patients or monsters, it's the fact that they were experimented on by questionable government scientists for the ridiculous purpose of creating psychic super soldiers. Which would sound like a video game plot if it wasn't for the CIA's MK-Ultra, Montauk, and Project Gateway programs, which are all very real, very documented instances when the CIA tried to research how possible it was to make someone psychic. Look this up when this video is done, okay? The infamous projects have served as the inspiration for a few things, with Montauk and MK-Ultra directly inspiring the Netflix series Stranger Things. Sometimes the strangest things are the things that really happen. But the strangest thing about Outlast? Why does your guy never try to fight back, even once? He only has the camera, I get that, but he's not even gonna try picking up a pipe or something. He's got feet, he's got hands, I don't know, I'm still bothered about this, we gotta move on. Number 3, S.T.A.L.K.E.R, Shadow of Chernobyl. Well, given the title of the game, I bet if you really think about it, you can probably imagine what true event S.T.A.L.K.E.R is based on. But if you're not a fan of GSC's ultra brutal apocalypse RPG horror series, S.T.A.L.K.E.R, which is an acronym for Scavengers, Trespassers, Adventures, and I honestly can't remember the rest. Anyway, you play a S.T.A.L.K.E.R, someone who traverses the hostile irradiated hellscape known as the Zone, the surrounding areas around Chernobyl, which have become host to all sorts of threats from zombies, mutants, bandits, and radiation. It paints a pretty grim scenario. In the world of S.T.A.L.K.E.R, the Chernobyl incident occurred the same way it did in our real world. Mismanagement and improperly constructed equipment led to a disastrous accident that irradiated the surrounding area, causing everyone to evacuate and causing a state of emergency. Where the timelines differ is that in S.T.A.L.K.E.R, after this accident, some secret Soviet scientists go back to Chernobyl to use it as a lab to conduct all sorts of nefarious experiments that eventually lead to a collapse in reality, tearing open some holes, anomalies everywhere, an even bigger disaster, letting loose all manner of monster and mutant onto the surrounding areas. Such is life in the Zone. Obviously, things didn't get this bad in the real world, and as far as I know, there's no bloodsuckers lurking in Pripyat. I've never been, but you know, I've heard. But the real Chernobyl incident was about as horrifyingly close to a full-on apocalyptic incident as we've ever come. Interestingly too, as a little S.T.A.L.K.E.R tidbit, S.T.A.L.K.E.R is very loosely inspired by a piece of classic Russian cinema. Unless you've got a Criterion channel subscription, maybe you didn't know this, but the 1979 film S.T.A.L.K.E.R, which which is set in a hostile, strange environment where the laws of physics no longer apply, is led by scavengers who hunt through the strange land called the Zone. There's not a lot of post-apocalyptic mercenaries fighting zombies, and mostly it's just kind of esoteric musings. It's loosely inspired, but it's still very much worth noting if you're a big fan of grim dystopian European media, and if you like S.T.A.L.K.E.R, you'll probably like the other S.T.A.L.K.E.R. Moving on. Number 2. Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame was a series of survival horror games that put the player in control of various investigators in 1980s Japan, revolving around taking photos to find ghosts, plain and simple. The games are downright horrifying, with the developer's original intended mission statement being to make the scariest game possible, and there's quite a few fans who would agree with that. Although there's been a bunch of Fatal Frame games, the one we're going to be taking a look at is the very first. The first game in the series was largely inspired by a real Japanese urban legend ghost story, The Legend of Himuro Mansion. The story goes that a long time ago, a family lived in Himuro Mansion who participated in a strange ritual called the Strangling Ritual, which would seal off bad energy from within the earth. The family would choose a maiden, isolate her from the rest of the world to not attach her to the earth at all, thinking that this was part of the ritual if she got too connected to the material world. On the day of the ritual, she was bound by ropes and attached to horses, and you honestly don't want to know what comes next. The last ritual performed by the family ran into a bit of a hitch when the maiden fell in love with a man who tried to save her, leading to the patriarch of the family raising his blade to the maiden, then on his own family, then himself. The story goes that if you take a photo of the Himuro Mansion, you're able to see a ghost in the frame, which is what directly inspired the main gameplay mechanic of Fatal Frame, taking photos of ghosts. Now, I wouldn't feel super right if I didn't mention the tagline that boasts that Fatal Frame is based on a true story was only ever included in the North American release of the game, not the Japanese or European ones. So either it is inspired by this urban legend, or that was just something they put on the box to sell a cool game. Either way, Fatal Frame rules, and that's really all there is to it. And number 1, Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil has always been one of my all-time favorite series, and Resident Evil Village was like a kiss from Capcom on the cheek as a longtime fan. It was like RE4 and RE7 had a beautiful baby. It's probably the most out there the series has ever got, trading out the usual zombies and tentacle monsters for fairy tale horrors, werewolves, ogres, and a very tall vampire who I'm pretty sure at least 50% of the audience already knows a lot about. But as fantastical as Resident Evil Village is, did you know how much of it was inspired on reality? Yeah, well, okay, somewhat. First and foremost, the infamous Castle Dimitrescu was directly inspired by a real castle in the Carpathians where the game is set, Castle Pelish. If you look at some comparison images, it is like the spitting image down to the layout of the interior of the castle. Make sure to check those drawers for red herbs and ammo if you're ever passing through. Well, what about the lady of the manor, Miss Lady Dimitrescu herself? Well, tragically, there aren't any 9-foot-tall vampire women, and if there are, call me. Art director Tomonoro Takano shed a bit of light on the inspiration for the very infamous lady. Her impressive stature is based on a Japanese urban legend called Hachisu Hakasama, an 8-foot-tall woman with long black hair wearing a long white dress and a big brimmed hat. The Hachisu Hakasama lures men away by imitating the voices of their loved ones. While Dimitrescu never lures Ethan away this way, she does hold his baby hostage, so she's got the holding your loved ones thing down pat. But this urban legend wasn't the only inspiration for the lady of the manor. Dimitrescu is inspired directly by Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian countess of infamous renown, who was thought to be an occultist, a vampire, a demon, or something evil. Bathory was legendarily cruel, and would take great pleasure in the pain she inflicted on her victims. She allegedly would bathe in blood from the peasant girls she'd abducted, and would bite them and subject them to unbelievable cruelty. Lady Dimitrescu's castle features a massive bathtub of blood directly inspired by this legend, not to mention the medieval torture cellar she keeps down below in the basement. Lady Bathory never had claws or a second form in her boss fight, but she was undeniably one of the scariest women to ever live. And sometimes the truth is way scarier than the fictions. Number 5. Resident Evil 3.5. When Resident Evil 4 came out in 2005, it seemed like space-age technology. The game didn't look like anything else. Its unique third-person camera and focus on tight gunplay made it feel unique, tense, like the action was up close and personal. Since then, pretty much every big budget action game owes a little something something to Resident Evil 4. If we didn't have Leon S. Kennedy spin-kicking farmers in rural Spain, we wouldn't have The Last of Us, Dead Space, Uncharted, God of War, Bioshock. All of these games, developers have openly admitted were influenced and inspired by RE4's wild leaps in game design. So it's fascinating to think that a slightly different timeline could have played out if we had something different. The first ever gameplay demo for Resident Evil 4, referred to as Resident Evil 3.5 or Hallucination or the Hookman demo, is a small little peer into a world where Resident Evil 4 stuck to the same style of gameplay as the original game, with a fixed camera perspective and a stronger focus on horror in ways the series hadn't ever seen before. And there were no zombies or mutant crocodiles or any of the usual flesh monsters this time around. Instead, we saw series mainstay Leon going against what looked like ghosts and the supernatural, cursed dolls, and, if the demo's to be believed, his own mind. In this build of the game, Leon is infected with a virus that causes him to hallucinate, manifesting in you fighting enemies that weren't even there. It's a really cool idea, and one that wouldn't show up again until Resident Evil Village, all the way in 2022, nearly 20 years after the demo was first shown off in 2003. Now, unfortunately for Resident Evil diehards like yours truly, this E3 demo is all we ever got of the Hallucination or Hookman build. No playable version has ever come out, nor are we even really aware if it ever truly did exist, or if all of this was more of a mock-up proof of concept. Now, in the end, we got the right game. Resident Evil 4 was a once-in-a-lifetime magnum opus of game design. It's probably my favorite game of all time. I think I've played it more than I've had hot dinners, and I'm glad it's the one we got. But it's fun to think about what could have been. In the 2 years between this footage and the final release of the game was unrecognizable, changing literally everything except the protagonist and his amazing leather jacket and haircut, leaving us only able to speculate what would it have been like if we got this one instead. Would we have seen a golden era of haunted baby games? And if you're looking for more top scary content, hey, may I recommend Top 5 Scary? We've got horror games, horror movies, monsters, ghosts, goblins, UFOs, pretty much everything scary under the sun and even above it too. So click through and I am certain you'll find something worth screaming at. Number 4, Rule of Rose. Now this one is a tiny bit of a cheat since of all the games on this list, this one is probably the most you can actually play. But it's a more unknown horror game, so I wanted to stick it in there because who knows the next time I'll be able to talk about it. Rule of Rose was a PS2 game developed by Punchline Studios, a very small Japanese game studio whose only other video game developed was a very cute game named Tulip about being a mailman. Nobody's ever heard of it, it's adorable, the Game Grumps played it if you want to check it out. Well, aside from that, their other game was Rule of Rose, a game about being tortured and trapped in an esoteric fairy tale world run by young girls who have developed classism, so they have consistent themes. It takes some big cues from Lord of the Flies, telling a society of English youth in ruins. The plot is, it's hard to summarize and there's no way I'd be able to do it justice in 2 minutes, so let's just say it's very esoteric, it's open to interpretation, takes a lot of cue from fairy tales, and it's scary in a way a lot of scary games aren't. The team's goal was to create a new type of horror game, citing the Brothers Grimm and their fairy tales and Silent Hill as their main inspiration for horror. Now, Rule of Rose is an interesting case for why it's forbidden, because a lot of the controversy surrounding this game wasn't actually in the game, but rather stemmed from rumor and panic over this alleged content. You know, early reporters had wrote that the game featured inappropriate eroticism, obscene brutality, despite the fact that none of these things actually happen in the game. The game was a victim of its own perceived reputation, and it was banned across Europe from being sold. It was cancelled outright in the United Kingdom, France, Australia, New Zealand, and a few other little countries here and there. Justice Minister of the European Union, Franco Frattini, he spoke out about this incident, saying he was disappointed he wasn't consulted before it was outright banned. And he used the game as an example as to why government officials need to meet and discuss with gaming industry representatives to ensure they're not censoring content and maintaining freedom of expression, citing that he felt most officials who spoke so fiercely about Rule of Rose had not actually seen any of the game's alleged content, but was basing it off of promotional media or rumor. That's oddly fitting, I think, that the people making rules about it didn't even bother reading anything about it, just banning it outright. No, they're just like gamers getting mad at stuff they haven't played. Now, you're not outright forbidden from playing Rule of Rose, but good luck getting a copy. It's not available on any digital marketplaces, and physical copies for the original release tend to start at around $200. So if you're curious about it, you can always open up another tab on YouTube and try and watch a Let's Play. Much, much, much cheaper. Number 3, Dead by Daylight and Stranger Things. Now, if you're a horror fan and a horror gaming fan, the odds are pretty good you've got a few hours logged on Dead by Daylight. Or if you're like your charming host here, you've got somewhere around, I think we're hitting the 500-hour mark. That's all I do when I'm not filming. It is a horror fan's best dream. It's a multiplayer game that pits horror's best heroes, like Ash Williams or Jill Valentine, against horror's nastiest monsters like Michael Myers, Jigsaw, Ghostface, and way more in a 4v1 experience that is just like unlike anything else. It's frequently copied, but nobody does it like they do. One of the coolest things about keeping up with Dead by Daylight is that every few months, developer Behavior drops a massive content pack to keep the game fresh, usually featuring some new playable characters on both sides, some new maps, and most of the time they're original characters from the team, but the most exciting ones are the ones where we get to play horror icons, like the Stranger Things cast. One of the biggest chapters in Dead by Daylight was the Stranger Things crossover, featuring the Demogorgon as a playable monster, Steve Harrington and Nancy Wheeler as playable survivors, and a brand new realm in Hawkins' Lab and the Upside Down. The characters looked amazing, and like most of the licenses in Dead by Daylight, the team did an amazing job translating the characters' personality through their gameplay. Like the Demogorgon's unique power as it digs through tunnels in the Upside Down, or for example, Steve Harrington's perk set kind of reinforces him as a babysitter. You know, you get all these perks to help out the team and kind of take hits for other people, and the map was lovingly recreated, immersive, and it felt ripped right out of the show. Fans of Dead by Daylight and Stranger Things were thrilled up until 2021, when Behavior lost the license for the Stranger Things content, meaning Hawkins, Steve, Nancy, and the Demogorgon all had to be pulled from the game. Now, if you'd already paid for them, you could still keep them as playable characters, but if you hadn't bought them, then you are completely out of luck. They are gone, and there is no way to access them in the game whatsoever. Now, Steve and Nancy, it's sad, but their skills at least got added to the general survivor pool, but the Demogorgon and Hawkins are a really sad loss, as that's unique content to the game that is totally inaccessible. Hopefully someday the trio can return to the game, or even a new Stranger Things chapter. I would be stoked if they added like Vecna as a playable character or Hopper as a survivor. It's an idea for you there. Here's hoping the license come back. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but I'm gonna keep speculating. You know, stranger things have happened. If you got what I was doing there, it's like a little pun on the show. We'll move on. Number 2, Sad Satan. With a title that immediately sets off something in your head and graphics that look like they're not from this timeline, Sad Satan is an incredibly evocative game wrapped in mystery. We've talked about it before on this channel, but it's a very bizarre piece of internet history that's worth exploring time and again. The story surrounding Sad Satan is probably more interesting than the actual game itself to me. The gameplay is pretty rudimentary, the graphics are primitive, and on a first pass, you'd be forgiven for not having too much to write home about. You walk down a simple linear corridor, and there's these NPCs that look like little crying people. They line the halls, and there's weird jump scares that'll come out at you. You'd think that this was just somebody's student project. Well, except for all the really strange stuff inside the game. Recordings of infamous criminals like Jimmy Savile or Charles Manson, you can be heard speaking. There's images of victims of crimes, accidents, blood-curdling screams, audio from a Swedish radio number station, and a lot of references to real-life criminal acts. Now here's where things get odd. Sad Satan was first discovered by a now defunct YouTube channel called the Obscure Horror Corner, who posted a Let's Play of the game. And this was pretty much the first time anyone had ever seen it online. Obscure Horror Corner had said that he'd received a tip for the game from an anonymous source, and that it had come from the deep web. The game garnered attention very quickly for its mysterious and creepy content. Shortly afterwards, someone online claimed that the game that had been reported on wasn't the true version of the game, and that the true version of the game existed out there and featured much more illegal, darker content. Versions of this game were passed around chat rooms and forums claiming to be the real one. Some of these variants would contain things like illegal material or malicious software to brick your computer outright. Shortly after Sad Satan first became known, the Obscure Horror Corner disappeared, leading to a lot of mass guessing. Did he feel guilt and responsibility that this unknown game that should have been forgotten was being passed around because of his attention and it was getting people harmed? Was he the original creator of the game and he was looking for a way to virally market his creation? Like most things surrounding Sad Satan, no one knows for sure, and the mystery surrounding it almost is the game. And number 1, PT. It had to be, right? Our first entry had to be PT. Maybe the most instantly recognizable forbidden horror game, as unless you already have the playable teaser installed on your PS4, there is no way to play the game, which is a tragedy of the highest order, since what little we were given of PT is a near masterpiece. Please forgive me, I am about to wax very poetic and very nerdy for something I am way too passionate about. Everyone and their baby knows PT was a proof of concept demo demo for a revival of the Silent Hill franchise being helmed by Metal Gear Solid's visionary and all-around weird creator Hideo Kojima, alongside the immensely talented lover of the macabre, Guillermo del Toro, as well starring Norman Reedus as the protagonist. For horror fans, this was like the ultimate gift and then some. Silent Hill had been on ice for years, and everyone was curious about what Kojima was going to be doing now that Metal Gear Solid had been retired. Kojima had openly talked about wanting to do a horror project, and in the middle of 2015, a mysterious game appeared for free on the PlayStation Store dubbed PT from a development studio no one had ever heard of. The game was short and incredibly simple and is relentlessly terrifying. To date, it's probably one of the single scariest digital experiences I've ever played. You're trapped in a hallway of a suburban house, trying desperately to escape, and you're being pursued by the ghost of an extremely upset woman hunting you who may be your dead wife. It's classic Silent Hill stuff. Each time you get to the end of the hallway, you find yourself back at the start, only each loop changes more and more, getting more horrifying and outwardly disturbing. The atmosphere of this game is like a mile thick. They did so much with so little. Now, that same year, after PT had been announced and won everybody over, and before the release of Metal Gear 5, it came out that Kojima had been let go from Konami, the owners of Silent Hill and Metal Gear. After Kojima's firing, the project was scrapped altogether, and the game was pulled from digital marketplaces and pretty much scrubbed from the internet. So if you didn't get a chance to play PT, the best you can do is look up a YouTube Let's Play of it and hold up a controller and pretend. Now, while we'll never get to play this Kojima Del Toro Reedus collaboration, Death Stranding released in 2019, and it is just chock full of Guillermo Del Toro, Norman Reedus, fetuses, bizarre horror, monster energy, peeing, walking whales, and lots of walking around hills to beautiful Icelandic indie music. And if any of those things sound appealing to you, you should definitely play it, because Death Stranding was great and everybody slept on it. And this year, Silent Hill is coming back, and while Kojima's not directing, the games we're getting do look amazing, from the remake of Silent Hill 2 to the all-new Silent Hill F. It has never been a better time to be a fan of either of those creators.
Bringing us off at number 5, we have Devotion. When this game was first released, a lot of folks were claiming it was the next big thing in horror. Some compared it to the unfortunately cancelled PT, saying that the atmosphere and exploration elements put it among the scariest out there. Developed by Red Candle Games out of Taiwan, Devotion is a scary, thoughtful game about exploring the home of a family under the power of a religious cult. You play the role of a screenwriter who has fallen on hard times. As his family finds it harder and harder to make ends meet, he turns to the teachings of a cult leader who says he can cure his sick daughter. This leads to a deep obsession with the cult, prompting the father to perform many sickening deeds as the family spirals into darkness. It's an unsettling story made scarier by the atmospheric gameplay. However, none of the actual scary stuff is the reason behind the ban. Devotion was pulled from Steam after players found a political joke mocking Xi Jinping. Infamously known as the Art Asset Incident, this little joke caused immeasurable harm to the developer. There was a hidden poster in the apartment that reads, "Xi Jinping, Winnie the Pooh moron." If you're aware of Xi Jinping's absolute power in China, you'll understand why this was such a big deal. As Red Candle was based in Taiwan, where they were nominally outside of the reach of China's regulatory bodies, not much could happen to them. But Devotion's Chinese publisher, IndieVent, was not. After a review bombing campaign by Chinese gamers who found the poster, the publisher had their business license revoked for engaging in illegal activities that endanger national security, social, and public interest. So while the game itself is scary, it's not quite as frightening as speaking ill of the Paramount leader. Coming in at number 4, Phantasmagoria. This point-and-click adventure game was revolutionary when it first came out. 7 discs, filmed in a multi-million-dollar blue-screen studio with a Hollywood director. It was pretty nuts, at least technically. Full motion video, live-action actors, the whole 9 yards. We follow Adrian, who moves into a mansion with her ponytailed husband and is haunted by the spirits within. As it turns out, the house was once inhabited by Carno, a serial wife-murdering lunatic. This, of course, leads to a whole bunch of flashbacks in which we discover details about all of the domestic violence. The kills range from being stabbed in the mouth with a trowel and filled with dirt to a full-on head-twisting torture machine. Most of the gameplay wasn't any more offensive than a gory B-movie, but of course, because it was a video game, there had to be hell to pay. Granted, it was on the gory side for a lot of games when it was released. Some folks even called it one of the bloodiest games ever at that point. But the major controversy really boiled down to a scene in which some non-consensual activities took place. For this, major retailer CompUSA refused to stock it, religious organizations organizations and politicians decried it, and Phantasmagoria was even refused classification in Australia. I suppose there aren't many surprises there, to be honest. While it pushed the envelope at the time, I wouldn't say it deserved all the bad press it got. Gory, creepy, and pretty corny too, Phantasmagoria is definitely a relic of its time, but hey, people have got to get mad at something, right? Coming in at number 3, Manhunt 2. The follow-up to Rockstar's controversial Manhunt, this is a game that was doomed to be sewered by uptight and puritanical people the world over. While it is full of brutal violence, most of the public outcry stems from an incident relating to the first game in the duo. In 2004, there was a murder case in which Manhunt was presented as evidence. A 14-year-old boy was beaten to death and the game was blamed. The argument did not hold up in court, but folks who were involved with or following the case seemed to believe that there was a direct correlation with Manhunt and the violent actions of a disturbed teenager. Back to Manhunt 2 though, right out the gate this murder simulator received banned and ratings refusals across the board. Germany, Ireland, Italy, Malaysia, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, the UK, all sorts. Even in the land of the free, America, Manhunt 2 claimed an adults only rating from the ESRB. Well deserved too, I suppose, as the game does feature excessive gore and high impact violence. One of the game's key features involves using stealth to perform over-the-top executions on the poor suckers that might get in your way. For this, the British Board of Film Classifications rejected it outright. The board cited an unrelenting focus on brutal slaying, casual sadism, unremitting bleakness, and a constant encouragement of visceral killing. Sounds like a good time all around, but hey, Britain's also got football hooligans to worry about. I can't blame them for trying to keep the violence at a minimum. The ban meant that Manhunt 2 couldn't be legally supplied anywhere in the UK. Truly an illegal horror game. But don't come at me with that Manhunt isn't horror nonsense, alright? It's literally an interactive slasher. Daniel Lamb and Leo Casper, baby. Coming in at number 2, we've got Active Shooter. This game wasn't even able to make it to digital store shelves, and it's no surprise either. In a world where it seems like there's a new mass shooting every couple weeks, creating a video game where you play as the lone gunman probably wasn't the brightest PR decision. Granted, you can choose between playing as a SWAT team member responding to the shooting as well, but you can probably foresee some issues with the concept itself. Once made public, the game was intensely critiqued, especially by those who had been affected by the Parkland shootings. Something like this is insensitive to the students and families, and really seems like a game only meant to shock and horrify. The game itself is nothing special, published by a man who has a long history of misbehavior on the Steam platform. It appears that the person behind Revived Games is well known for being a troll, with a history of customer abuse, publishing copyrighted material, and user review manipulation. In all likelihood, this person was just trying to get this kind of outraged reaction from the public. Their plan worked, but also the game is now permanently off of Steam. And finally at number 1, Assault Day. Yeah, the title isn't really Assault Day. It's a little less politically correct. Investigate at your own risk. This is another instance of a developer making something for the sole purpose of being controversial. Published by indie developer Jake Roberts, it was later revealed that this was apparently an alias for US Air Force official Mikhail Randolph Upjohn. It's a visual novel taking place during a zombie apocalypse. The player controls a menacing serial killer rapist as they make their way through the rapidly deteriorating world. However, survival and teamwork aren't really on the main character's mind. No. In Assault Day, the assault and abuse of women is encouraged to progress the plot. Dialogue and action options are presented, most of which involve the exploitation of female NPCs. Upon hearing about the gameplay elements, people scrambled to have it removed from any and all platforms ahead of its time. Well, it was indeed pulled from digital marketplaces that didn't prevent the game from being downloaded. According to Upjohn, it was too late to ban the game as copies had already been distributed. And of course, nothing ever really disappears from the internet. In the meantime, many organizations are doing their best to prevent further spread of the game. In South Africa, there are online monitors being tasked with constantly checking platforms that could potentially distribute the game in the future. Punching its way into number 5, we have Thrill-Kill. This would-be Mortal Kombat competitor never actually released thanks to the controversy surrounding its subject matter. Thrill-Kill is a game full of violence and sexual content, as most horror-themed fighters should be. There were BDSM costumes, fetishistic acts, limb dismemberments, and super suggestive special moves. Get a load of some of these. Slap. Going down. Swallow this. Classic. Unsurprisingly, it garnered an adults-only rating ahead of its release. Although, surprisingly, it wasn't because of the sexual content, as is with most games that get the AO rating. It was actually for its violence. Because of this, it never released. Near finished builds were uploaded to the internet though. So why was an almost finished game never released to the public? Well, around the time it was slated to hit the market, EA bought out the publisher, Virgin Interactive. Electronic Arts, being the worst and all, decided that the game would be harmful to their image and opted not to release it. In fact, they deemed it so offensive that they wouldn't even attempt to sell it off or have it released by somebody else. That's a thrill kill buzz kill if I've ever heard one. At the time, it was highly anticipated, a lot of people seeing it as the new Mortal Kombat of sorts. 4-person 3D gameplay, adult-themed characters, thrill kill finishing moves, it was shaping up to be the next big thing. Later down the line, when folks got their hands on the bootlegged version, they were a little disappointed though. It just wasn't that fun to play. However, the engine it was developed on lived to support many other fighting games, ranging from Wu-Tang Shaolin Style to Rock'em Sock'em Robots Arena. Maybe the kids playing X-Men Mutant Academy sensed that there was a cattle prod wielding dominatrix somewhere in the code. Sprinting in at number 4, we've got Rule of Rose. This survival horror game for the PlayStation 2 got banned all over the place for content that wasn't actually in the game. Seriously. It was at the center of a moral panic in Europe after a bunch of false information was circulated. The game itself is about a 19-year-old woman named Jessica who ends up trapped in a world run by young girls. The focus is on psychological horror, not shock and terror, and thus takes a look at the mysterious and misunderstood nature of young girls. It's largely inspired by Brothers Grimm fairy tales and the atmosphere of Silent Hill. You basically just run around with your dog and avoid doll-like creatures called imps for most of the game. There's a boss fight here and there and some mildly scary stuff that happens, but nothing seems too outrageous. The actual gameplay elements seem to have been overlooked in favor of how the game was perceived though. Sony decided against an American release, claiming that the elements of violence involving children didn't fit their corporate image. Publisher Atlus then stepped up to release it on their own. Around this time, a whole lot of rumors were circulated after a discussion about morality and violence in video games was published in the Italian magazine Panorama. There were allegations that Rule of Rose had scenes of children buried alive, sadomasochism, and underage eroticism, which were patently false. This did not stop people from running with the story though. European Union Justice Minister Franco Frattini led a campaign against the survival horror game, painting it as obscene, cruel, and brutal. The push resulted in a motion for the resolution on a ban of sale and distribution of the game in Europe, which also led to suggestions that it be banned in France and Poland. All of this was based on very little information, and you can bet that none of the folks talking about it had ever actually played the game. After all was said and done, the Australian, New Zealand, and UK releases were cancelled. Sheesh. For a relatively tame horror game, it garnered a lot of attention. Splattering in at number 3, we've got Splatterhouse. Something about chopping demons in half with a meat cleaver doesn't sit right with the morally pure, huh? It was no surprise when Splatterhouse, the 80s style slasher-inspired beat-em-up, was unceremoniously pulled from dozens of arcades across America. In this horror classic, you play as Rick Taylor, a man who allows himself to be possessed by a cursed mask in order to gain the power required to save his girlfriend. Then he absolutely tears through screen after screen of demonic baddies and ghastly ghoulies. Makes you just want to whip a wrench at someone's head. I'm not crazy, you are. It was actually the first video game to come with a parental warning, which read, "Warning, this horrifying game may be inappropriate for young children and cowards." Damn, Splatterhouse, you're just asking for the cowards to come out and ban you. The arcade cabinets were licensed to Atari for distribution in North America, and like all good, cool things, it was controversial there. Violence, gore, and references to Christian symbols like the cross. It's brainwashing our youth, get it out of there. So after 100 cabinets were sold, it was banned. I'm sure the owners of the arcades were thrilled. Eventually, there was a port made for the TurboGrafx 16, but it was toned down. Less blood, no crosses, and a red mask to avoid the Voorhees connection. This was not the end of the Splatterhouse ban story though, no, not by a long shot. Like most classic franchises, Splatterhouse got a mediocre 3D remake in the PS2 Xbox 360 era. And like most violent video games, Germany said, get out of here with that nonsense. Oh, Splatterhouse, you're too splattery for your own good. Coming in at number 2, we've got Condemned: Criminal Origins. Speaking of German bans on video games, let's talk Condemned. This first-person horror game found itself in a sticky situation in the land of Volkswagen. Known and beloved for its brutal melee combat using improvised weapons and CSI-style investigation elements, Condemned is one of the better-received horror games of the 2000s. You play as Ethan Thomas, a man framed for murder, looking for the serial killer who did him dirty. The population of Metro City is going insane, and no one seems to have an explanation, so you're just gonna have to fight a bunch of homeless people as you piece together the mystery. One of the big gameplay elements involved using what's known as finishing moves, where you ruthlessly kill an enemy that you've incapacitated. This often took the form of snapping necks or headbutting people to death. German law abiders took issue with this and ended up confiscating all copies of the game because of a law that outlaws the dissemination of media that describes cruel or otherwise inhuman acts of violence against human beings in a manner which expresses or glorification or rendering harmless of such acts of violence which represents the cruel or inhuman aspects of the event in a manner which injured human dignity, which I suppose describes a lot of horror media. A major point that a lot of people took issue with was the fact that there was really no way to avoid these violent encounters in the game. No stealth mode, no tactical choices, just go ahead and beat a homeless man to death for being crazy. Fair enough. And finally, at number 1, we've got S.T.A.L.K.E.R. Yeah, this is another one of those where I'd rather not say the title out loud. The real title is not, in fact, Assault-Lay, it's something else, but I'm sure you get the idea. The contents aren't any better either. In this Japanese eroge game, you play as a stalker who likes to grope women on public transit. When he gets caught and called out by a teenage girl, he decides to use his father's political leverage to take revenge. The whole game is you stalking, groping, and then assaulting a family of 3. The ages of the people in that family range from 12 to 40. Not great. Thankfully, the stalker dies at the end no matter what, but does that really change anything? Many folks took issue with this game, garnering attention from British members of Parliament, the Women's Forum in Australia, and members of Equality Now, who wrote to the then Japanese Prime Minister Taro Aso in protest. After receiving all this attention, the game was taken off of digital marketplaces and eventually was restricted from being sold in Japan. This actually prompted the developers and publishers of similar games in Japan to ban foreigners from their websites to avoid further controversy.
Starting off this countdown, we have the Dead Island series. Dead Island is a 2011 survival horror video game. In this game, you have to survive in a zombie-infested world. Basically, 4 playable characters find out that the majority of the population has been infected by this plague. As a result, people are now these zombie-like flesh-eating creatures. The 4 characters, though, are not infected, and you have to find a way to survive and escape off of an island. Now, let's talk about the fun part. Why did it get banned? Well, you end up killing these zombies in pretty gruesome ways. Like you can run them over or stab them or smash them with baseball bats, you get it, okay? Of course, when this happens, there's a lot of blood and gore. Not only that, but severed body parts can be seen scattered across the island. You can also dismember the zombies, and in one scene you even see a kiddie pool full of blood. In another, you have to rescue a woman that's about to be sacrificed by her tribe. As a result, Dead Island was put on List B for Germany. List B is for games that contain extreme torture or other dark content. With that rating, it makes it illegal for stores in Germany to sell this game. Even shipments heading into the country are seized at customs. It was also banned in Australia as well. Coming in at number 4, we have Bully. This is a 2006 action-adventure video game that was developed by Rockstar Vancouver. For this game, you play as a student named James or Jimmy Hopkins, a mischievous schoolboy who got expelled from every school he's ever attended. As a result, he gets enrolled in Bulworth Academy. The story then revolves around him as he tries to become more popular in this school, while taking on liars and cheats and bullies. Now, this game came with a lot of controversy, especially from parents and educators. They claimed that the game promoted bullying and violence in school. In fact, a lawsuit was filed in an attempt to have the game blocked from store shelves in Florida. They claimed that this game would give a rise to school shootings. In fact, they referred to it as, and I quote, a Columbine simulator. Another point of concern was the sexuality present in the game. I mean, there are a bunch of missions you have to complete, and if you succeed, you get a kiss from a girl. You're also allowed to make out with girls to receive health bonuses. You also have the choice to kiss certain boys, and people were not happy about that. So it was banned in places that don't want to promote homosexual content. Other sexual themes involve a gym teacher who apparently hits on the young students, and there's also an adult store in town called Come Hither. Yeah, very punny. As a result, this game was banned in Brazil. They said it was potentially harmful to teens. They also said that anyone caught selling or owning the game will be fined. In our 3rd spot, we have Left 4 Dead. This game was talked about a lot in the comment sections of the past parts of this video, so I decided to include it on the list for you all. This is a first-person zombie survival shooter game. The game takes place in Pennsylvania. There's an outbreak of a virus known as the green flu. It's highly contagious and turns people into these wild zombie-like creatures. You and the other survivors then have to reach the safe house while killing a bunch of these zombie creatures along the way. Now you have a choice to use a number of different weapons to do the deed. On top of that, the more risks you take while playing, the more points you'll get, meaning you're penalized if you stall for too long or if you take a safe route. Players that take the riskier paths and act fast will be rewarded. And of course, since you're killing zombies, there's gonna be gore and violence, which is why it got banned in Australia. In fact, the game is filled with blood spray and splatter, decapitations, and limb dismemberments. You can also cause people's intestines to spill out of their wounds. How great. The game was also banned in Germany for the same reasons. I believe you now can play the game in Australia, but that's because they heavily censored it. Like, they took out all the dismemberment parts and turned the blood color to green. In our second spot, we have Postal. A lot of you wanted me to put this game on my next list, so here it is. The Postal series is said to be one of the most controversial video game franchises in the history of gaming. I mean, it must be pretty bad to gain a title like that. Now, the one I want to talk about today is Postal 2. The second game in the series is the one that received the most backlash. So this is a 2003 first-person shooter game developed by Running with Scissors. I mean, the fact that that's the company's name, I mean, it says a lot. Anyways, the game follows the life of the Postal Dude. He is in charge of doing a number of mundane tasks throughout the game's week, like you gotta get milk or eggs or confess sins. You as the player can pick how he reacts to different situations. You can either be passive or super violent. If you choose the more violent option, you can do things like dismember random people or light them on fire. And at one point you're given the task to get treatment for gonorrhea after the dude discovers he's got an infection. But that task is only activated though when you choose him to urinate. Yeah, that's an option as well. Anyways, it's pretty weird to say the least. In the game, the Postal Dude gets mugged and attacked. He also encounters a cult, butcher shop workers that like to feast on human flesh, and you also encounter terrorists. The violence and gore present in this game upset many, and is why it got banned in multiple countries. So in 2004, New Zealand banned Postal 2 for, I quote, gross abhorrent content, urination, high impact violence, graphic vomiting, animal cruelty, homophobia, racial, ethnic stereotypes, etc. In fact, New Zealand went as far as to fining and arresting people who own the game. The fine was $1,400, which is pretty intense for owning a video game. The game was also banned in Germany, France, and temporarily in Sweden. And in our number one spot today, we have Harvester. Back in the 90s, this game was considered one of the most disgusting games ever created. It was also believed to promote violence, and some argued that this game would create serial killers. With that being said, let's discuss what this game is about. Basically, it's about a character named Steve Mason. He wakes up in some town and has no memory of who he is. Even in his own home, he doesn't recognize his mom or younger brother. But they both are acting weird. Like, his mom is obsessively baking dozens of cookies for a charity event that's a week away. And his brother is watching some weird violent cowboy show that seems to be the only program on TV. As you go on throughout the game, Steve tries to piece together who he is and what the heck is going on in the town. Doesn't sound that bad, right? Well, wrong. There are some severely messed up scenes in this game. Like when a bunch of children eat their mother, and she enjoys as they're doing it. Or the scene when two characters get it on, and only for the woman's father to be creepily watching you do it through a hole in the wall. And he also enjoys this. Ugh. Then you also have the fact that you can die from an STD in this game, and there's a lot of innuendos as well. Then in the game's final scene, you brutally kill everyone that you encounter with a bunch of different weapons. Because of all this and more, the game was banned in Germany and Australia. It was also banned in the UK, but then they just heavily censored most of the game, and then that's the only version you're allowed to play there.
Coming in at number 5, we have Manhunt 2. Manhunt 2 is a psychological horror stealth video game released back in 2007 and follows Daniel Lamb, a mental patient suffering from amnesia, as he tries to uncover his true identity. He is accompanied by Leo Casper, a sociopathic assassin who guides Daniel in his journey. Now, I should preface this point by saying my parents bought me this game on the Wii way back in the day. I must have been maybe 14 or 15 years old, but regardless of my age, it was still a truly messed up game to give someone, especially at Christmas Christmas? Now Manhunt 1 was incredibly chilling and controversial, with a different kind of horror to most of the games on our list. There are no ghouls or zombies, but saying that is far more monstrous than the rest. The gameplay itself centers on stealth, combat and brutal third-person executions, not to mention its horror film setting provides the perfect atmosphere to complement the game's gut-wrenching brutality. And that's the thing, you aren't fighting against otherworldly beings and monsters who have arisen from the dead. No, instead you're facing off against people, other insane inmates, as well as mysterious deadly organizations. This game is bloody and violent in all the wrong ways. It pushed the boundaries of what is morally ethical, with you torturing other inmates throughout. The violence is quite literally endless. The game was met with mixed reviews, however positive reception came from the game's presentation of graphic violence and its psychological horror-based storytelling, which is a bit of a surprise, to be honest. Despite that though, the game did fall short of its predecessor, yet it is equally as terrifying, but not in a good way. The violence is disturbing and your actions fill you with guilt. The game should not be played. Trust me. Coming in at number 4 we have Penumbra: The Black Plague. Penumbra: Black Plague is the second installment of the Penumbra series of episodic video games developed by Frictional Games. The story continues from the previous episode, Penumbra: Overture, showing the protagonist Philip moving away from the abandoned mine setting of the original to explore an underground research base. Now first and foremost, it should be noted that this game is also developed by the same people behind Amnesia: The Dark Descent, a game which may or may not appear on our list a little later on. Hint hint. Much like Amnesia, combat mechanics are shelved in favour of puzzles, stealth, and just plain running away in order to survive, instead of making this game scary the most. When you are rendered useless with no weapons whatsoever, all you can do is run or hide. You have no way of defending yourself, all you can do is try to survive. And what is scarier than that? Black Plague was received well by critics, IGN stating, "Without the awkward combat of Overture, Black Plague is a smoother experience where the clumsiness of the physics and control systems are exposed far less frequently." But like I said, there is nothing you can do to defend yourself other than run or hide, which makes this game absolutely horrifying. Please do not play it. Trust me. You'll be awake for many, many, many nights. Coming in at number 3 we have Fear. Fear, which stands for the First Encounter Assault Recon, is a first-person shooter survival horror game released back in 2005. The game's story revolves around a supernatural phenomenon, which Fear, a fictional force team, is called to contain. The player assumes the role of Fear's point man, who possesses superhuman reflexes, and must uncover the secrets of a paranormal menace in the form of a little girl. Now, this is one of the more unique horrors we have on our list, considering you can actually defend yourself with guns. Yay. However, those bullets are rendered useless by a little girl, standing at the end of a long corridor with lank black hair over her face and blood splattering all over the walls. Ultimately, this little girl makes gibbering wrecks out of all of us. The game was praised by critics, with the New York Times calling it as thrilling and involving as Half-Life, which is actually a huge compliment. Half-Life is incredible. IGN claimed that Monolith forges new shooter territory with some truly freaky elements, challenge, fun, and beauty. Now, the game is as scary as it is beautiful, however, when you involve demonic-looking children, things go from bad to worse and make the horror 10 times scarier than they have any right to be. If I were you, I would steer clear of this horror because Alma Wade will haunt your dreams. She may even haunt mine. Coming in at number 2 we have Siren: Blood Curse. Siren: Blood Curse is a survival horror stealth game and is a reimagining of the first installment in the series, Siren, with many alterations to structure and content. The story begins on August 3rd, 2007 and focuses on an American television crew that arrives in Japan to investigate and document the legend of Hanuda, a vanished village, where human sacrifices are said to have taken place 30 years prior. Along with other survivors, the humans must try to survive in the nightmarish village amid the summoning of an alien god and vicious monsters known as the Shibito. Whether solving puzzles, fighting, or fleeing the undead, Siren: Blood Curse offers a ton of tense atmospheres and a blood-curdling narrative. The game was praised by critics, with IGN stating, I quote, "increasingly suspenseful set of chapters and cutscenes, frightening jumps and gameplay sequences." One user summed up the game perfectly, stating, "Despite the hoops you need to jump through prior to playing, Blood Curse more than makes up for it with some of the most intense and perfectly paced survival horrors I've had the pleasure of being terrified by." And I honestly couldn't have put it better myself. Even watching gameplay on YouTube of this game sends chills down my spine, and in the scariest of ways. This game is truly terrifying to watch and play, and for that reason alone, it is best to steer clear of it, unless you want your sleep to be disrupted forever. Just saying. I don't. But for those interested, PewDiePie did play the game, and he's got a full gameplay on YouTube, so you should check it out. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have the one we were all waiting for. Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Amnesia: The Dark Descent is a survival horror game, and one that I quite literally couldn't even get 5 minutes through because I was absolutely terrified. If you have yet to play this game, just don't do it, because it is one of the scariest experiences of my life. The game itself features a protagonist named Daniel, who is exploring a dark and foreboding castle, while trying to maintain his sanity by avoiding monsters and other terrifying obstructions. You are quite literally helpless as you explore the gothic castle with no memory of how you got there. You are unarmed, and worse still, you are alone, with the castle's halls being stalked by monsters that lurk in the shadows. The game forces you to do everything video games typically don't want you to do. Flight over fight. You must barricade yourself in rooms or sprint through the winding halls while ghouls chase behind you, getting closer and closer with each turn. As you would expect, Amnesia received hugely positive reviews from the horror gaming community, with critics praising the ominous atmosphere and horror elements. I quote, "By strongly focusing on vision and hearing, the distance between player and game is radically diminished. Now this game should be illegal simply because of the pure horror it inflicts on us. The terror lingers long after you finish the game, with you constantly looking over your shoulder for the lurking presence who has been haunting you. Trust me when I say this game is not for the faint-hearted."
Number 5 on this list is Silent Hill Homecoming. Silent Hill Homecoming was initially not allowed to be released in a few countries and had to make a censored version because it was just too gruesome. What Culture says, the Silent Hill franchise has consistently offered up some of the most memorably unsettling imagery in the entire history of horror video games, and this reached a fever pitch with the release of 2008's Silent Hill Homecoming. When the game was being certified, Australia's Office of Film and Literature Classification objected to a horrific scene in which protagonist Alex and cultist Margaret Holloway wrestle over an electric drill, ending with either Holloway's face being drilled into a bloody mess or Alex getting drilled in the eye. Either way, not fun. The OFLC called this and several other mutilation sequences in the game high impact, enough to refuse it a classification, effectively banning Homecoming from being sold in the country. Much the same approach was also taken in Germany. The game was eventually granted a release in both countries. However, once Konami created a censored version several months later, in which these scenes were edited with new camera angles which concealed much of the explicit violence. Granted, many impatient fans had imported the bloodier original version from abroad by that point, resulting in the German authorities eventually seizing a shipment of uncensored copies in November 2010. So yeah guys, this game was basically listed as too graphic and scary to be shown in some countries. Germany and Australia typically pull the plug on games sooner than other countries for gore and violence, but still, that one scene that's described there sounds pretty bad. Literally, however you spin it, somebody is taking a drill to the face. Comment down below if any of you have ever played this game before and what it was actually like. Do you think that it deserved to remain illegal? Number 4 on this list is Fear 2 Project Origin. Australia has once again stepped in and shut this video game down. What Culture says, Australia's OFLC banned horror FPS Fear 2 Project Origin from sale in the country due to its extensive violence and unforgiving tone. Their statement cited numerous examples of the player's ability to inflict dismemberments, slit throats in close up, and spray blood across the screen, while expressing how disturbed they were by the game's enhanced graphics and realistic behavior of human and mutant foes. What exactly defines a realistic mutant? I don't know. Released years before Australia finally instituted the R18+ certificate, Fear 2 was refused classification as an MA15+, leading to its de facto banning. Many commentators pointed out the OFLC's bizarre hypocrisy towards horror-themed games though, given that more action-centric violent games like Grand Theft Auto and Gears of War had faced little resistance releasing in Australia. Regardless of the GTA release and other games that Australia has allowed to be played in their country, this one was not allowed. I think that because they ended up going in this direction, it should speak to how graphic this video game actually is. It might not have the same sort of dark murder simulator themes like some of the other sick video games on this list that we're going to get to, but apparently the gore is just brutal. I've never played any of these video games before, so if you're someone who has, then similarly to the last one, please comment down below your thoughts, and if you think it should have been banned everywhere, let me know. Number 3 on this list is Outlast 2. There are a lot of things about this game which make it one to avoid. What Culture says, despite the introduction of the R18+ rating in Australia in 2013, that still wasn't enough for first-person horror sequel Outlast 2 to be granted a release, at least at first, with the ACB taking massive umbrage with the game's implied sexual violence. Outlast 2 is certainly full of grotesque and, at times, envelope-pushing imagery, though given that no other major gaming market in the world followed Australia's lead, eyebrows were immediately raised by fans and, indeed, developers Red Barrels themselves. Hilariously, it turned out that Red Barrels had accidentally sent the ACB footage from the alpha version of the game, which contained especially transgressive content which the developer had already decided not to include in the final game. In a happy ending, the ban was overturned a mere 2 days later when Red Barrel sent in amended footage of the final build, which was granted a release under the R18+ banner. Regardless of whether the game eventually got released or not, it still is one of the most grotesque ones out there. It also has to make you wonder, what was in that first version that didn't ever get put out? What could have possibly made that so bad that the own creator didn't even want it in their own game? We may never really know, which in this case, probably for the best. Number 2 on this list is Manhunt 2. As if the original Manhunt wasn't bad enough, they decided to make a sequel to it. What Culture says, Rockstar Games is no stranger to courting controversy, and after the original murder simulator, Manhunt, was deemed injurious to the public good by New Zealand authorities while being incorrectly blamed for a high-profile UK murder, the publisher only doubled down on the transgressiveness for the sequel. Less than a month before Manhunt 2's planned release, it was refused classification by both British and Irish rating boards, with the BBFC citing its unremitting bleakness and callousness of tone, sustained and cumulative casual sadism, and unrelenting focus on stalking and brutal slaying. They also claimed the release posed unjustifiable harm risks to both adults and minors. Clearly, the panic among uneducated censors and fearmongers was that Manhunt 2's more realistic murder sequences might inspire the young and the vulnerable, who frankly shouldn't be playing the game anyways, to then take up arms after playing it. The US ratings body ESRB meanwhile issued it with an adults-only rating, and given that Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony categorically don't allow AO games on their consoles, it meant that Manhunt 2 was effectively also banned in the US. The game was eventually released in America several months later after Rockstar undertook comprehensive edits to the game's violence, namely blurring brutal executions or removing them entirely, while also ditching the rating system for kills. I love video games, guys, I do. And I love a good shoot 'em up game as well, like they're a lot of fun. But do we really need to have a murder simulator game? Like, is that actually something that we need in the world? The fun part about shoot 'em up games is the whole competition of trying not to get killed, trying to avoid dying and completing the objective. The fun part isn't the actual murder itself. And a game like this, that's basically what they're promoting. I think Rockstar makes some incredible games. The GTA franchise is amazing and Red Dead Redemption 2 was incredible, but I think that they missed the mark on this one. And finally, number 1 on this list is Hatred. I had never heard of this game before making this video, and honestly, I could have gone my whole life without knowing it existed. Gamers Decide says, Hatred is a game in which you play as the antagonist. The game features the antagonist going on a murdering crusade with only one goal in mind: to kill as many people as he can. Obviously, this did not go over so well with a lot of people. Hatred was banned in Germany for being too gruesome. This is to be expected since Germany doesn't really approve of these kinds of games, especially when the only goal of the game was to spread hate and murder as much as you can. However, interestingly enough, it was even banned from Steam for a short period after it was released, and it's still one of the games that are not allowed to be streamed on Twitch. Literally guys, you still can't even stream this game. That's how bad it is. I mean, it's basically just a mass murder simulator, which in all honesty, I wouldn't even want to play. In fact, I don't even know why this game was made in the first place. Like, in what way could playing a game like this possibly be fun? You would have a hard time even finding a way to play it now, but I highly recommend just avoiding it altogether.
Number 5. Berserk. Berserk, and no, sadly, not based on the awesome anime series, was an arcade cabinet produced in the 1980s. A pretty simple little maze shooty game where you play as a stickman zapping robots, fighting across the game's many levels. It was the 80s, this was like the moon landing back then. The game was a smash hit, people loved it, people loved playing it. There was even a home board game version you could get. The cabinets did very well. Berserk also features maybe the best villain in video game history, Evil Otto, who's a little smiley face that bounces around the room and gets ya. The only way you'd know he's threatening is because of his title, Evil Otto, and if he touches you the game's over, which is sad. I would personally like to know Evil Otto a little better and learn what makes him so evil. Well, if legend has it, if the player reaches a certain score, the LCD screen of the cabinet won't be enough to protect you from Evil Otto's malice, and he'll hunt you in real life. Doesn't seem so unassuming now, does he? 2 different people reportedly lost their lives after playing Berserk. The first, Jeff Daly, passed from a heart attack after getting his highest score yet in the game. The second, Peter Bukowski, experienced the same mysterious thing, heart attack after getting the high score. Both people were perfectly healthy before, showing no signs of risks, and media started to speculate that the stress of the game had caused this. Evil Otto apparently really gets to people. Autopsy reports showed that there was scarring on their hearts, suggesting that perhaps the game truly was too stressful for the players' hearts to handle. Perhaps it's best that the cabinets have been lost to time. Evil Otto sealed away, smiling for eternity in his digital prison. Hey, liking what we do? I like what we do. If you've been having a good time, why not consider throwing a little subscribe our way for daily horror content. Number 4, Babaruka. Babaruka is the newest entry on this list, coming to us from 2021. It's an indie horror game based off of kids' toys, mostly Tamagotchi. And the game is pretty meta. You play a fictionalized version of yourself, that's you, the player, who's received an email from their friend John telling them that they found a really interesting banned game that was sold on a laptop on eBay. And John emails you the file so that you can try the game too. A good friend. Now the in-universe game you're playing, Babaruka, is a cute little pet simulator where you get to look after some adorable little Pokemon-y bubble creatures, the Babaruka. At first, it would seem this is what the whole game is about, just taking care of your little guys, feeding them, cleaning up after them, all that. But it wouldn't be on this list if that was the case, now would it? Now there are creatures in the game that will hunt your little bubbles and you need to protect them from it. But as you keep playing, the meta-narrative about what happened to the original studio that developed Babaruka unfolds slowly as you piece together what had happened to them and realize why this game had been banned inside the game's universe. It goes well above any content or business decisions, and you start to become aware that there's some entity inside the game that you're playing. This thing, whatever it is, seems to have its sights set on you, the player, next. It's an interesting idea, definitely, having to beat a game not just to see it through to the end, but to make sure you're stopping an ancient malevolent evil trapped inside the Steam app /common folder and looking to wreak havoc on your computer and you. I don't want to give too much away about Babaruka. It's pretty short, and it's pretty cheap. If you're into inventive little horror games and you've got approximately $3 lying around somewhere, it's on Steam and it's worth checking out. The meta stuff is cool, and can you name me a second horror game based on Tamagotchis? I don't think so. Number 3, Polybius. I've talked about Polybius on this channel before, and I probably will talk about Polybius on this channel again because it is just too crunchy an urban legend for me to resist talking about it. It's genuinely one of my favorite little creepy stories on the internet. There's a half-decent chance Polybius and the legends around it probably inspired 1 or 2 entries on this list. The stories go that Polybius was an arcade cabinet released in 1981, produced by an elusive, mysterious studio named Sinister, a butchered German translation of the words to lose sense. Polybius wasn't like other arcade games and seemingly wanted something more out of you than just your parents' allowance. The game was similar to Asteroids, where the player plays a geometric shape blasting off against other geometric shapes. Like I said, again, it was the 80s. They didn't know about Apex Legends or Overwatch yet. This was as cool as video games could be. The simple game, though, was apparently so addictive that it would drive people to lunacy. Players were outright addicted to it, unable to think about anything other than Polybius after they played the game, reporting obsessive compulsive thoughts, dreams about the game, constant headaches, unexplained pains, and even going so far as people in arcades would break out into fights over who got to play next. Now where it gets very strange is allegedly the arcade in Portland, Oregon, where Polybius was first tested, would get regular visits from shady men in black suits who would watch the game being played, observe the crowd, take notes, and then leave without speaking to anyone. Now they wouldn't even collect the quarters. Now over the years there have been many attempts to try and track down Polybius and uncover whether or not it is just a decade-spanning urban legend, if it's a government conspiracy to train people or brainwash folks, or if it ever even truly existed. It's difficult because as the legend is so popular and widespread, there's a good amount of fan content out there of people who want to contribute their own way, like people making homemade cabinets or video footage of replications of what the gameplay looks like. Regardless, there's just as many stories online of people who insist they were at that arcade in Portland, Oregon, and have played that fabled game and have never been able to stop thinking about it since. Number 2, I'm Scared. Wow, do I love that title. I'm Scared - A Pixelated Nightmare is an indie horror game developed and released in 2016 by indie dev Ivan Zanotti. The game begins with a warning from Ivan himself, apologizing for what the game is going to do to you. The game warns you that it's going to manipulate your computer while you play, and I think way more games should do this, by the way. Start off by making a list of dangerous consequences for playing. Imagine if you booted up League and it told you that your friends were going to stop texting you back. Anyway, take a listen to this excerpt from the opener. This game will try to deceive you as many times as it can. In case something goes wrong, feel free to check the folder in order to report any error. I'm extremely sorry. I didn't really want to do that. Forgive me. Now, as you can probably guess from that foreboding intro crawl, the game is a surrealist experience, being closer to a pixelated nightmare more than a traditional video game. As you play the game, you realize the antagonist of the game isn't just a spooky ghost, but rather you're going toe-to-toe with one of the game's many glitches that has developed sentience and a personality of its own, and is very intent on tricking you and messing with you as much as possible. The terrifying little entity, dubbed White Face by fans of the game, seems to be having the absolute time of its life scaring you. You, the player, not the protagonist of the game. Like the warning said, I'm Scared will alter files on your computer, write things in your notepad, and all sorts of scary horror stuff to make you feel like you've downloaded something onto the hard drive you can't take back. All in all, it's actually a really cool gimmick and an incredibly inventive little horror game that's not leaving this list without a huge recommendation. I go gaga for any breaking the fourth wall stuff in a video game, like Undertale and all its save file stuff, and putting yourself up against a malevolent entity where the screen isn't enough to protect you. Very cool. It costs less than a Big Mac on Steam if you feel brave enough to give it a try, and invite whatever horrors are inside it onto your computer. Number 1, Pokemon Red and Blue. Now it's time for one of my favorite Pokemon urban legends, right after Mew hiding under the truck and pressing down B on a Pokemon being caught. The original Pokemon is probably one of the most well-loved video games of all time, iconic in just about every single aspect. You remember that first time starting in humble Pallet Town and working your way through the gyms of Viridian City, Vermilion City, all the way to Lavender Town. Yeah, Lavender Town. And maybe it was just because I was literally a child, but Lavender Town used to scare me to tears, made my hair stand on end. The whole game is so cute and friendly and wholesome, and then you take a quick stop at a town where they're obsessed with the dead, and for the first time your little brain entertains the possibility that maybe your Pokemon have mortality and could die. Yeah, the whole town is just unsettling too. You remember the music? It was the eerie lo-fi beats that made it seem like something was different, like something was wrong. Well, there's a very famous urban legend called Lavender Town Syndrome, and I'll admit this stuff actually scared me so bad as a kid I never wanted to play it again. The story goes that the music for Lavender Town contains a high-pitched tone unnoticeable to anyone but younger ears that will drive you to madness. All manner of urban legend was built around this. Stories of kids complaining of constant headaches, pain, anxiety, nightmares, and discomfort listening to the Lavender Town music. Some variations of the tale suggest that the tone only exists in Pokemon Red, with dramatic versions including some backstory saying director Satoshi Tajiri has an aversion to the color red out of a dislike of violence. Now, is Lavender Syndrome real? I feel like I have a personal duty, because of how much this particular story genuinely scared me as a kid, just to come out and say no, it doesn't. Now, admittedly, very interestingly, the themes for Lavender Town are ever so mildly different compared to the Japanese and widespread North American release, with the North American version sounding ever so slightly less harsh. Now, there could be any number of reasons for this outside of a curse, but you have to admit it is some good wood for the fire if you're writing a story about scary music. Now, most likely is that Lavender Town was already a very unsettling part of a cheery childhood memory for a lot of us, and that music genuinely is creepy regardless of context. I mean, listen to it right now and you will feel a little uneasy. You almost don't even need any urban legends surrounding Lavender Town to assume it's cursed in some way.
At number 5, Texas Chainsaw. As the title suggests, this game is based entirely on the Texas Chainsaw, an iconic horror movie that came out in 1974. The movie is about a deranged killer known as Leatherface who, well, goes on a massive wielding a chainsaw. The movie garnered massive success despite a small budget and quickly became one of the most well-known horror movies of all time. The film featured plenty of violence and gore and spawned a whole heap of sequels and spin-offs that are still coming out today. And of course, it also spawned an amazingly terrifying game that came out August 18th this year. The game follows a similar concept as the movie, featuring a group of survivors being chased around by Leatherface and his crazy killer family, who have a penchant for human flesh. Many of the maps in the game feature many of the iconic locations from the movie, including a new area made specifically for the game, the Family Slaughterhouse. The gameplay is deceptively simple, but very creative. It's an asymmetrical survival horror game, meaning that players play in teams of uneven sizes. 4 players play as the victims, attempting to escape, and 3 others play as the flesh-hungry family, with one of them being Leatherface himself, trying to kill the victims before they can escape. This concept of asymmetrical horror games has become a trend in multiplayer horror games since the release of Dead by Daylight in 2016, but the scale of 3 versus 4 is unique to Texas Chainsaw, making it stand out against the rest. With this large player count of 7, you can play with your friends, strangers, or even your family if you guys are into that. The victims start the game off in the basement, trapped with Leatherface. Once they escape his clutches using different tools at their disposal, they need to find an exit from the map to escape and win the game. Meanwhile, Leatherface's family will be hunting down players, impeding on their attempts at escape and trying to kill them. A neat feature is the family's grandpa, who must be fed the innards of the victims and is woken up if there's too much noise, and it will reveal the locations of every victim on the map that's moving. This makes for a fun game of cat, 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 and mouse, mouse, mouse that allows for lots of replayability and an assortment of different outcomes to each map. The game is available on all platforms but Nintendo Switch, and plenty of people are playing it right now. I'm not sponsored, but now is a great time to get the game if you're interested. Next at number 4, World of Horror. Now, this game technically is both already released and is yet to release, as it's been available to play in beta since February of 2020, but is getting an official release on PC, Switch, and PlayStation on October 19th this year. Unlike the fast-paced action of Texas Chainsaw, World of Horror is a more slow-paced role-playing game with a 1-bit pixel art style that matches well with its manga-inspired themes. The game takes place in the town of Shiokawa, Japan, where the player must investigate and explore various cursed and haunted locations, fight otherworldly creatures, and climb a hellish tower in order to stop the apocalypse. Upon opening the game, the player is immediately greeted by its two-tone art style, taking clear inspiration from the works of Junji Ito, a world-class horror mangaka known for making some of the most iconic works in horror. If you haven't read any of his work, I really recommend it. He's made some truly terrifying stuff. Off the bat, you're given the mission of exploring all sorts of different locations, which are all these self-contained horror stories, featuring terrifying monsters of all kinds. They vary from ghosts to demons to beings of pure cosmic terror that will keep players at the edge of their seats throughout each playthrough of the game. And with a massive collection of different stories and scenarios to experience, World of Horror makes for a very replayable experience, giving players hours and hours of fun and terror to have. The game has players solving assortments of puzzles, exploring haunted locations, and its main feature, turn-based combat. In many scenarios, players will have to fend off against the dark forces that inhabit Shiokawa, usually only using a trusty knife or other tools in order to go toe-to-toe with these eldritch abominations. A really memorable fight I had was in a high school against a woman with a big slit for a mouth wielding scissors. I was able to beat her with an inch of my life using nothing but a trusty baseball bat. This kind of underdog mentality keeps the game fun, rewarding, and scary as hell. If you're looking for a game you can pick up and play at any time, I'd recommend keeping an eye out for World of Horror this October. Moving on to number 3, The Outlast Trials. Outlast is by far one of the most popular horror game series of the 21st century, making waves with its first release, being praised for its terrifying gameplay and charismatic villains. The first 2 games have you as an investigative journalist in some dark and murky parts of the United States. They're both first-person games and are known for being in the perspective of camera footage taken by each of the protagonists. This camera makes for the main gameplay feature of the game, with the player having to maintain the battery of the camera in order to use its night vision mode. Unlike the last 2 games on this list, the player has no way of defending themselves. Instead, stealth is the focus, as you try to avoid the deranged killers out to get you. The Outlast Trials, released in May, acts as a prequel to the rest of the Outlast series, taking place as a mysterious Cold War experiment. The survival horror title is the first in the series to feature multiplayer, allowing up to 4 players to join and try surviving together. And instead of using a camcorder like the previous protagonist of Outlast 1 and 2, players are wearing night vision goggles, trying to escape the nefarious experiments that are being administered on them. Players can pick one of 4 classes to play as, with each class having a unique ability, such as seeing through walls, healing other players, placing mines to deter their pursuers, and a throwing device to temporarily stun enemies. They can also pick up various items such as antipsychotic, lockpicks, and healing items, but can only hold 3 at a time. With past titles focusing on the aspect of being alone and trying to survive, this game encourages teamwork and coming together as a common goal, making the horror a lot more bearable for those who hate to be alone. But trust me, the game is still terrifying. The only question is, can you guys outlast these trials together, or will you all die together? I guess you'll have to play the game to find out. Number 2, Resident Evil 4 Remake. Now, I may be a little biased, but the Resident Evil series is one of, if not the most iconic survival horror series of all time, dropping instant classics at every release, and RE4 Remake is no exception. Now, I'm not sure if you guys know, but the original Resident Evil 4 is one of the most influential video games of all time. The game revolutionized action games, and of course horror, with its iconic over-the-shoulder camera and action mechanics. Not only that, but it features loads of personality and style, with its snarky protagonist Leon Kennedy, a cop-turned-secret agent sent to a remote village in Spain to rescue the daughter of the President of the United States. Of course, this is where things go wrong when he finds out the village is plagued with these zombie-like villagers known as the Ganados, infected by a deadly parasite called Las Plagas. The remake follows the same plot, but features modern-day graphics and gameplay that look and feel as smooth as a baby's bottom. The remake retains the same over-the-shoulder camera as its predecessor, but has more modernized features to suit a modern audience. Famously, the original RE4 would force the player to stop moving so that they could aim, attack, and shoot, but in the remake, the player can move freely while doing this. This decision by the developers sparked controversy amongst longtime fans of the series, as it dulls some of the challenge brought by the original game. But to most, it was a welcome inclusion. Another big change was the exclusion of quick time events. An iconic part of the original game was its quick time events, that you would need some quick reaction times to press a designated button in order to dodge boulders, attacks, and even battle Leon's old army buddy, Krauser. While this was a relatively new concept when the original game came out, it became such a popular trope in video games that many gamers felt fatigued by it. So it was removed in the remake. Regardless of its changes, Resident Evil 4 Remake has quickly become another iconic title within the Resident Evil universe, and acts as a worthy rival to the game it's based on. Now you might be wondering, if Resident Evil 4 is such a great and terrifying game and it's at number 2, what could possibly be taking the number 1 spot? Well, at number 1 is Dead Space Remake. Yes, another remake topping off this list, but it wouldn't be a top 5 horror game list without Dead Space. Another incredibly iconic horror classic, remade with some amazing graphics that will simply take your breath away. Dead Space, originally released in 2008, is a survival horror game that puts you in the shoes of systems engineer Isaac Clarke, as he joins a search and rescue team for the USH Ishimura, a spaceship that went radio silent after receiving a message from his girlfriend Nicole. When Isaac's ship crashes into the Ishimura, he's tasked with exploring the ship while fending off against demonic creatures called necromorphs, and saving his girlfriend before they get to her. In order to fight these monsters, he uses modified mining tools and the special abilities of his spacesuit. The game was famous for its limb destruction features, originally introduced in Resident Evil 4, but taken to another level in this game where players could certain limbs of the necromorphs in order to incapacitate them. His spacesuit is also capable of things like telekinesis, allowing him to move objects around and freeze them in place in order to face off against powerful enemies and solve difficult puzzles. The game's atmosphere is like no other, the dark hallways of the Ishimura beckoning like the abyss, with frightful demons waiting for you at every corner. Dead Space is pretty well known as one of the scariest horror games of all time, and the remake is no different. With a complete graphical upgrade, the game only gets scarier, and if you've played any game in the Dead Space series, you'd be able to tell pretty quickly why it's earned its number 1 spot on this list.
Number 5 on this list is Something's in the Sea. A much shorter video game than some of the other ones on this list, but still just as terrifying. Something's in the Sea comes from Yahtzee Croshaw, longtime Lovecraftian horror fan, and the the pedigree is apparent. This tense and tightly woven nightmare is his 10th game, and the experience really shows. The game focuses on the lone survivor of a plane crash who now finds themselves stranded in the ocean with nothing but a boat and the pieces of an artifact they are being compelled to reunite. Unfortunately, you won't just be fighting your limited lung capacity to bring the pieces back from the sunken depths. You'll also be trying to escape a massive undersea creature that doesn't appreciate your efforts. There's very little text in this game, and what is there contributes beautifully to the uneasy atmosphere. Apparently, this game really dives deep, no pun intended, on the sea monster that Lovecraft used to love writing about. I mean, his most famous creature, Cthulhu, was based in the sea, so I imagine you'd be getting a lot of different creatures like that in this game as well. And as we know, it's the creatures that make Lovecraft so scary. He certainly had his way with words, and I don't want to take anything away from him in that regard, but I truly believe the thing which brought him the most fame was the fact that he would write about giant, writhing masses of flesh that would resemble some incomprehensible gross thing. In this horror game, you get to travel many feet below the sea and fight these disgusting beasts. Although, if you are faint of heart or find that you have a hard time going to sleep after watching and or playing horror-related things, then I really wouldn't recommend playing this thing. Number 4 on this list is The Consuming Shadow. The name of this game just sounds ominous as hell and like something directly from Lovecraft's mind. Cog Connected says, The Consuming Shadow tasks the player with stopping a shadow that is trying to enter our world. If this ancient is permitted to enter our reality, then it will change the world irrevocably, tearing the very logic of existence asunder. You don't want that to happen, so you grab a shotgun or a book of spells, get into your car, and start looking for clues on which eldritch being is trying to pull a fast one. Gather enough information, save towns from corruption, and kill enough monstrous servants of the ancient, and you'll find a way to seal it. Just be careful. You literally cannot kill this thing, and the game's sanity meter means that if you slip up, you can end up taking your own life in a fit of madness. This game is part retro dungeon crawler, part adventure game, part roguelite, and its horrific atmosphere and writing are excellent. The graphics, much like Something's in the Sea, are deliberately retro. Maybe the game developers didn't intend for this to happen, but a fun side effect of this game is that not only will your in-game sanity slip, but it's possible even your out-of-game real-life sanity could be at risk depending on how long you play for. Retro graphics aren't usually super terrifying, but if they have the right story attached to them and all other elements of the game are rock solid, then they can be. Apparently this game is incredible as far as the horror genre goes and nails literally all of that, which makes this a great game for what it intended itself to be, but also a super scary horror video game that you should be very cautious with if you're the type of person that chooses to play it. Number 3 on this list is Fallen London. This one is just about guaranteed to keep you up at night if you choose to play it. Cog Connected says, Fallen London may be the best browser game out there. It's certainly the best steampunk / Lovecraftian horror / comedy browser game. In this game, London has been stolen, or perhaps sold, and buried deep within the earth. The Neath is dark, dank, and so far from the sun that the laws which govern existence are beginning to break down. You find yourself in a realm where death rarely sticks. Hell is just a train ride away, and the giant alien bats who now own London will pay top dollar for love stories. It's a sprawling world filled with countless quests and story hooks, some of which are heartwarming, some of which chill the blood. Most of the story Fallen London has to offer range from delightfully creepy to mildly discomforting, but some of it will leave you sleeping with the lights on. Go on, seek Mr. Eaton's name, I dare you. This game is constantly being added to and expanded on, and at this point, I'm afraid to estimate how long a full playthrough might actually take. The evil monsters and their designs here are all based off of a Lovecraftian horror, and even though this game isn't expressly dealing with Cthulhu or anything like that, it has been classified in that genre. It is a very scary game that you can get sucked into. Problem is that it's hard to remember what reality is and completely leave the game once you're done playing. Images of Lovecraftian monsters and evil hell bat things will cycle through your mind as you're trying to live your everyday life. If that sounds like fun to you, then go ahead, play it. If you do play it though, can you tell me all about it please? Because I for one will not be partaking in a playthrough myself. Number 2 on this list is The Darkest Dungeon. So this game walks an interesting line between gothic horror and Lovecraftian horror, which makes it all the more scary in my opinion. COD Connected says, in this game you play as the heir to a dilapidated and monster-infested estate, directing a group of flawed heroes to try to make up for your ancestors' terrible mistake. Seeing as the estate is now absolutely infested with the undead and more esoteric, sanity-destroying foes, keeping these heroes alive and sane is easier said than done. The focus on the many ways your hero can self-destruct makes this game genuinely uncomfortable at times. Darkest Dungeon sets out to address the psychological stress of adventuring, and good lord, does it succeed in making dungeon diving seem like the worst job in the world. Even being night guard at Freddy Fazbear's might be preferable, and the ancient portal under the estate is still threatening to let terrible things into our world. Gothic horror and that genre has always been particularly scary to me, so mixing that with the always terrifying and gruesome Lovecraftian stuff, that really makes it a match made in scary heaven. I think that the best word to describe this game is truly uncomfortable. Even at the low points of the plot, you never really feel like you can sit comfortably. There's always something just around the corner waiting to get you, and it just gives the person playing this an overwhelming sense of anxiety all the time. And finally, number 1 on this list is the Call of Cthulhu. This is probably the most famous Lovecraftian horror video game, maybe ever. The breakdown of the game is as follows. Private investigator Pierce is sent to look into the tragic death of the Hawkins family on the isolated Darkwater Island. Plunge into a world of creeping madness and shrouded old gods within Lovecraft's iconic universe. Your mind will suffer, balancing a razor-thin line between sanity and psychosis. Cryptic clues, shadowy figures, and pure terror bar your way as you fight to retain your sanity and solve an otherworldly mystery. I watched the trailer for this game, and it is unsettling to say the least. I haven't personally played it because that would kind of go against the title of this video, but damn, it looks like a lot, guys. Like, the main character goes through a freaking roller coaster of emotions during that trailer, so I can only imagine what the full game experience is really like. During the trailer, there are a bunch of lines of text that flash up, basically little highlights of reviews that people have made of the game. Terrifying, unsettling, horrifying, will keep you up at night. These are just a few of the things that those reviews were constantly saying. Obviously, this game is a masterpiece in the Lovecraftian horror genre, but it might be a little too good. Lovecraft stuff is scary enough just in my imagination, let alone playing it all out. If any of you folks have actually played this game before, then I would love to hear about it firsthand. Do you recommend it, or should we stay away?
Number 5, Observer. Observer, a 2017 release from Bloober Team. That's a great name, Bloober Team. The same studio behind the acclaimed Layers of Fear series, as well as the Blair Witch and The Medium. So if you're a fan of those ones, hop on in. Observer is a unique psychological horror game. Set in a cyberpunk-style dystopia heavily inspired by the classic sci-fi film Blade Runner. Observer wears its inspiration on its sleeve, even going as far as to cast Blade Runner's villain, Rutger Hauer, as the protagonist, Daniel Lakowski, who is an observer, hence the name, there we go. The Observer is a futuristic police officer who can hack into people's brains and scan their memories. This is like a Black Mirror nightmare come to life. After receiving a call from his estranged son, Daniel is sent to investigate a possible killing in a rundown apartment block where he finds a, body. It's headless, it's horrible. It's the worst thing you want to find. It's a horror game, you know what's up. From here, a lockdown is triggered and Daniel must discover what has caused the murder. where his son is, and what is locking the building down, and of course, what is going to be a very long night. It's a ride, you're in for a treat. The game is a first-person perspective with emphasis on exploration, investigation, and stealth over combat. It's kind of like Batman, dare I say, with a heavy atmosphere. Where the game shines is any of its observation sequences, where Daniel gets to hack into other person's, consciousness, seeing twisted virtual dreams that start to blend into the real world, keeping you wondering what's real and what's, an old man's implants just malfunctioning. The classic situation, eh? Which is which? The atmosphere of Observer is incredible, with few other games doing what they accomplished here, painting a very hyper-focused picture of a claustrophobic rundown dystopian apartment block, creating a haunted digital nightmare that will leave you cold, paranoid, and fearful, all the while wanting to explore every end of the building. It's a little twisted. Observer is available on current and last generation consoles as well as Steam, and if you're a fan of horror, if you're a fan of cyberpunk, and if you're just a fan of video games, it comes with a hearty recommendation from our boy Taylor Smith. Number 4, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Coming to us from Ninja Theory, the team behind Heavenly Blade and The Devil May Cry, where Dante didn't look like Dante. Senua's Sacrifice is an intense third-person horror game set in a dark fantasy world inspired by Nordic culture. You play Senua, a young woman trying to make her way into Helheim to confront the goddess Hela and attempt to save her fallen lover. Now, Senua believes herself to be cursed, when in actuality she suffers from psychosis, and the game really makes you feel like you are too. It's kind of twisted. The entire time you experience these audio hallucinations, talking to you at every moment, questioning your every decision, yelling at you randomly, speaking to you, and even guiding you when needed. With headphones on, you'll actually feel like you've got voices in your head. It's so scary. It's incredibly creepy and immersive in that fantasy way that only video games as a medium can be. Senua's gameplay is mostly about exploration and puzzle solving, featuring some really inventive stuff with the environments, trying to find patterns and runes in the natural formation of things to progress, traveling through different gateways and portals to slightly different dimensions. It all sells the feeling of not being all there mentally. There's no heads-up display or anything, just a dry screen, giving the game a really cool cinematic feeling as well. Whenever I play video games, I always take off the HUD. I'm like, let's just do it, let's just live it. Because it immerses you into the storyline. You don't have things distracting you, right? Which, in this case, is chock full of tons of paranoia and horror, so you really want to dive in that. You'll face off against spectral warrior enemies, and while the combat isn't going to take home any gold stars per se, it's frenetic and tense enough to keep you sweating the entire time. The game warns you that should you fail a combat sequence too many times and die too many times in a row, the game will outright delete your save file at that point, and then you'll have to start over from the beginning. That's terrifying. That's the scariest part I've heard so far. With that in mind, in the back of your head the entire time, each combat encounter feels desperately personal, with a feeling of real stakes. Imagine Mario Party? Yeah, spin a 4. If you get a 3, delete. Number 3, Until Dawn. Yes, who doesn't love 80s slasher movies? This is good. They're one of my guiltiest pleasures. I love seeing a series of stock archetype one-note characters get cut down by a cool monster wearing a goalie mask, of course. Don't worry, he's actually quite nice in real life, not that scary. Until Dawn, the 2015 game from Supermassive Studios, offers us a chance at directing our very own cult 80s slasher movie, right? The premise is as simple as you'd want. A group of teenage school friends go up to a cabin in the woods for the ultimate party in a secluded spot in the Albertan mountains. Just what you want every summer, of course, our dream. Am I including this game because it takes place in Canada? Entirely possible. As you'd expect, the teen finds there's something else in the mountains with them, something haunting. And you'll have to do their very best to survive until dawn. Yeah, you guessed, that's cool. That's the title. Until Dawn puts you in control of all the various characters throughout the night, and you'll have to do everything you can to keep them alive, making split-second choices and decisions that can have consequences that you might not expect. A wrong move can lead your favorite character suffering a grisly fate right in front of you, leaving you guessing and afraid, really putting you in the shoes of these helpless fools. These helpless teenage dreamers. This game is a great time, regardless, but if you really want to see Until Dawn at its best, get a few friends over, grab some popcorn and pizza, live it up, turn it into a co-op game by passing the controller around as each character's perspective. The game implores you to do this, and now we on Top 5 Scary implore you to do the same. Until Dawn captures all the stuff we love about cheesy horror movies. Getting to see it unfold for you personally also makes it seem like Until Dawn is a horror movie catered to your own personal tastes. Do you want to see everyone suffer the most horrific fate possible? Great, go for it. Intentionally blow the entire thing, or are you looking to see your survivors harden into tough as nail warriors and, make it through the night with everyone possibly, hopefully, coming home? Well, your quick wits and decision making will be all that you have to rely on. So kill it. Until Dawn's gameplay is very simple, comprising almost exclusively of quick-time events, including all combat, so it's ideal for those who don't even game that much to just hop in. Really couldn't recommend this one enough. The studio has also put out The Dark Pictures and The Quarry, which are spiritual successors to Until Dawn, and all worth it in their own right. But the original stands the strongest, in our opinion. You can find Until Dawn on PS4, and it usually goes on sale for less than the price of a movie ticket, so wait around a bit. Number 2, Soma. Soma comes to us from Frictional Games, the Swedish development studio that proved themselves to be masters of horror, giving us Amnesia, The Dark Descent, and defining the indie horror game scene for years to come. Amnesia was a hard act to top, I'm not gonna lie. While some might disagree, Soma is an excellent successor. Soma is a first-person exploration horror game, putting us in the eyes of Simon Jarrett. Also, have to shout this out quickly, but Simon lives in Toronto, and I don't know how many Torontonian viewers we have here, but you have no idea how massive it was to play a video game where you go to Osgood Station, you know what I mean? Simon, a bookstore clerk who after a car crash goes in for a medical experiment, he finds himself awaking hundreds of years in the future, under the sea after a cataclysmic event has wiped out humanity. Yeah, just the ideal scenario. Wear a seatbelt, I guess. Simon finds himself as humanity's sole survivor, trapped alone, far away from home, surrounded only by machines that believe themselves to be human beings, and mysterious creatures that are vicious, horrific mergings of machine and flesh wandering through the deserted halls of the undersea research station. It's yucky. Soma is terrifying in a way that gets underneath your skin. It doesn't rely on jump scares, per se. In fact, there's almost none in the game whatsoever. The terror, rather, comes from the indescribable feeling of being completely alone. As you and Simon explore the facility, you'll do your best to piece together what happened, and you'll find yourself, the player, asking questions you have difficulty answering. It's really difficult to talk about Soma without giving away too many beats about its plot, obviously, but if you're a fan of sci-fi, especially anything like AI, like Westworld, or even Blade Runner, well, you'll find yourself right at home in Soma's extremely existential storyline. Something worth shouting out also is Soma actually has an option to toggle off the monsters entirely. So if you want to solely experience the storyline without any of the stealth sequences whatsoever, and while it might sound strange removing all the enemies from the game, it actually really works here. Since so much of the game is actually about feeling empty, it serves the atmosphere quite well in that case, so worth a shot. If you struggle with difficulty in games too, it's a perfect option for those who are just looking to experience the unique storyline, you know? It's also kind of like a horror movie, right? Soma is available on PS4, Xbox One, and Steam. And last but certainly not least, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Yeah, this one I've played for a hot minute. This one's scary. When it comes to survival horror, we need to pay respects to the old masters. Absolutely. Resident Evil has been king of survival horror and goofy cutscenes since 1998, and Resident Evil 7 might genuinely be one of the best of them all. The series' traditional third-person and fixed camera perspectives is amazing. It's always a good time. Moving from the series' traditional third-person and fixed camera perspectives, Resident Evil 7 puts you in the first-person driver's seat. It is terrifying. Protagonist Ethan Winters finds himself trapped in a Louisiana plantation looking for his wife, and he ends up the victim of a sadistic family of seemingly immortal, regenerating hillbilly lunatics. Yeah, that game. You're probably thinking, oh, I've seen that. Yeah, it's terrifying. It looks very real. It's quite new, this one. This game is horrifying. While Resident Evil has always drawn inspiration from American horror cinema, namely things like Night of the Living Dead or Evil Dead, Resident Evil 7 draws from grittier sources, with the influences of that of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or Saw, or Hostel, all being uncomfortably present, right? The things that happen to Ethan in this game are enough to put you in therapy. It is wild. My hands were sweating certainly playing this. Ethan finds himself infected with the same substance affecting the family, meaning he can take unbelievable amounts of physical punishment, and boy howdy, does he ever. Yeah, and you see it all in 4K. It's one of the few video games that I forgot was a video game, you know what I mean? It's kind of like Red Dead Redemption. You're like, oh yeah, I forgot I'm doing this. This is crazy. If you're feeling particularly brave, you can play Resident Evil 7 in VR, in an experience that's so horrifying it's almost too much to handle. I can't even play VR normally, let alone VR horror. Are you kidding? I play the mini punning and I'm like, this is too much. This is Black Mirror. I'm out. It puts you as close as possible to the horror around you. Slowly creeping around the disgusting Baker estate, desperately hoarding what life supplies you can find, while of course trying to elude your seemingly immortal psychotic captors, will have you standing on the edge the entire time. You'll literally be standing up while you play, like you're 8 years old playing GameCube. It truly feels like you're fighting for your life the entire time. As a longtime Resident Evil fan, number 7 surpassed my expectations and brought the series back to its rightful place as king of horror. And if you're a new fan, it's the perfect place to jump in the madness. The follow-up to Ethan's story, Resident Evil Village, is spectacular as well, and I wish we had time to talk about it, but Alas, we don't. That's what part 2s are for. They're both excellent, but the horror in 7 is simply unmatched. That's all I'm saying. In my opinion, the absolute scariest game on the market right now, and it might not be topped for a long time. Comment down below if you agree, disagree. Also, comment down below your favorite game. Can't believe they're doing horror on VR now. That's the worst thing I can ever imagine.